Hey guys, tonight we're going back to the year 1900, an era of candlelit rooms, soot-streaked cities, and a version of America that looks more like a sepia-toned fever dream than the nation you know today. This is a world where horses still rule the streets. Tuberculosis is the vibe killer at every party, and the phrase work-life balance sounds like a joke a steelworker would cough out between shifts. And I hate to break it to you, but yeah, you probably won't survive this. Not unless you're rich, male, white, and lucky enough to dodge diphtheria and the occasional boiler explosion. But hey, you're already here, so we might as well look around. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now before we jump into this chilly, soot-covered time machine, tell me in the comments, what city are you in, and what time is it where you are? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step onto a cobblestone street in 1900. Immediately your nose fills with a cocktail of smells: coal smoke, manure, unwashed humanity, and something faintly sweet that you hope is bread and not decaying fruit. The world is slower here, but somehow louder. There's the steady clip-clop of horses pulling carriages, children shouting as they dart barefoot across filthy streets, and men in stiff hats arguing in a swirl of cigarette smoke. The air hums with the sound of steam, metal, and shouting. Welcome to America at the turn of the century. Depending on where you land, your experience will vary wildly. If you're in New York City, you're plunged into a noisy, electric chaos of immigration, industry, and overwhelming ambition. Tenements climb the skyline like crooked teeth, each packed with families from Ireland, Italy, Russia, and places your history textbook probably ignored. You might pass by a ragged boy selling newspapers at the top of his lungs. Extra! Extra! President McKinley shot, not realizing that you're witnessing history before it's been memorialized in a museum. But take a train or a long bone-rattling wagon ride out west, and the scene shifts entirely. Dirt roads, wide skies, and a quiet so expansive it almost buzzes in your ears. Rural life dominates most of America. The vast majority of people still live in towns so small you could spit across them. Electricity? Maybe in the schoolhouse. Maybe. Running water? Only if you count a bucket. Farmers rise with the sun and go to bed exhausted, their hands cracked and stained, their futures tied directly to the whims of weather, blight, and a bank that couldn't care less. And yet, there's something surprisingly optimistic in the air. It's an age of contradictions. This is the height of the Gilded Age, when millionaires like Carnegie and Rockefeller throw lavish parties under gaslight chandeliers, while children crawl under textile machines to earn 5 cents a day. There's a strange belief bubbling up that the future, somehow, will be better, that the next generation won't have to boil their water or sleep 6 to a bed. One very real historical detail here: in 1900, only about 8,000 cars existed in the entire country. That's right. Cars are basically unicorns with wheels. If you see one, it's probably owned by some eccentric rich guy who wears goggles and calls the car a horseless carriage. The roads? Oh, they're not roads. They're mud traps with the occasional plank laid down in a half-hearted attempt to prevent your boots from vanishing up to the ankles. Now for a fringe fact that feels like a fever dream. In the year 1900, you could buy radioactive water as a health tonic. No, seriously, it was called Radithor, and people actually drank it thinking it would give them energy and cure diseases. Spoiler alert, it did not. It gave them bone cancer. But for all the weirdness and wonder, the early 1900s remain deeply divided. Women can't vote. Black Americans live under the daily threat of Jim Crow violence and lynching. Native populations are still reeling from forced relocations and broken treaties. The US has just officially annexed the Philippines, Puerto Rico and Guam after the Spanish-American War, and there's a hot debate brewing about what kind of imperial power America is becoming. That's one of the biggest scholarly debates still alive today. Was the early 1900s the beginning of true progress, or just the start of a more sophisticated form of inequality? Sure, factories bring jobs, and inventions start popping up like mushrooms after a thunderstorm, but they come wrapped in soot, corruption, and a brutally high cost of human labour. Historians still argue whether this was the golden age of invention or just a gilded cage hiding America's worst instincts. Back on the ground, you're still standing in the middle of a street where horses poop freely, and children treat trolley cars like jungle gyms. A newsstand sells pamphlets for a nickel, and a nearby diner offers beef stew for 10 cents. but you'd better bring your own bowl. Electricity is flickering inside a few buildings, and gas lamps light the rest. The contrast is jarring, like stepping between centuries on a single block. You duck into a general store, shelves are lined with lye soap, patent medicines with ingredients nobody can pronounce, bolts of calico fabric and dusty tins of coffee. The clerk greets you with a nod but watches you closely. Shoplifting is punishable by a good old-fashioned public shaming, or worse, jail in a place with rats the size of your cat. Outside again, you glance at a newspaper and see headlines about union strikes, anarchist bomb plots, and the continuing battle over labour rights. The industrial machine is roaring to life, and not everyone is thrilled to be caught in its gears. But there's laughter too. Families gather on porches, musicians play on corners, kids play stickball in the alleys. Even in the grime and struggle, life pulses with a kind of fierce, unbreakable spirit. People are building something, sometimes with joy, sometimes with desperation, but always with the hope that the future will thank them for it. And so, you walk on, boots kicking up the dust of a country still defining itself, still pulling itself forward with coal-dusted fingers and raw, aching dreams. So let's get you properly situated. Imagine waking up in this world, whether it's to the clang of a milkman's cart on the cobblestones or the cluck of a chicken that wandered into your kitchen again. Where you live in early 1900s, America makes all the difference in the quality of your survival. If you're in a major city like Chicago, Boston or Philadelphia, you're waking up to dense air thick with coal smoke and whatever the factory next door belched out overnight. You rub your eyes and reach for the chamber pot under your bed, because the closest indoor toilet is 2 blocks away, if you're lucky enough to live in one of the new modern tenement buildings with shared plumbing. Meanwhile, out in the country, the rooster starts screaming at sunrise whether you want it to or not. You throw on a wool shirt that's never quite dry and shuffle across wooden floorboards that groan like they're complaining about the hour. The windows are frosted even in spring, and your breath clouds the glass. You pump water outside, start a fire in the stove and hope you've got enough wood chopped to make it through the morning chores. There's no neighbour within a mile unless you count the cow, and she doesn't gossip, which, frankly, is a plus. Urban life is dense. In cities, buildings are packed like sardines, 5 or 6 floors high, each apartment housing entire families, sometimes multiple families, sharing the same small kitchen, bathroom, if there is one, and whatever air makes it through the cracked windows. Tenement housing is the urban standard. You'd be lucky to have a window that opens or enough space for your youngest sibling to not sleep in a dresser drawer. Sounds like a joke, but it happened. Fire escapes double as balconies, laundry lines, and escape routes when your neighbour's illegal stove setup inevitably sets something on fire. If you're a newcomer to the city, an immigrant just off the boat, your first home is likely a shared one-room apartment with your cousins, their cousins, and a screaming baby no one seems to claim. Privacy is a myth. Everything smells faintly like soup and wet wool. But there's a community feel, and in your tiny ethnic neighbourhood, you hear your own language, see familiar faces, and cling to traditions that make the chaos feel just a little like home. Now contrast that with rural life. The countryside is quiet, but not peaceful. It's survival on a schedule. Wake, milk the cows, feed the pigs, haul water, chop wood, tend the field, fix the fence, and repeat until you collapse face first into cornbread. Life is cleaner in the sense that the air smells more like hay, and less like factory grease, but it's also lonelier. Rural children walk miles to a one-room schoolhouse, if they go at all. More often they're needed at home to help with the endless list of chores that never take a day off, not even on Sunday. You'd think the rich have it easier, and you'd be right. The elite of both city and country live in a different reality. Think gaslit mansions with parlour rooms, electric buzzers to summon servants, and actual bathtubs filled with hot water, from pipes. Their children wear white lace. Their wives host teas. They read the newspaper in silence instead of arguing over whose turn it is to empty the coal ash. But here's the thing. They make up less than 1% of the population. You, statistically, you're either a labourer, a farmer, or a child worker already behind on rent. Let's talk about smells again. Yes, I know it's weird, but trust me, your nose would never recover. In the city, open gutters and slaughterhouses send up a perfume that sticks to your clothes. Horses leave behind little gifts, hundreds of pounds of them per day per block, and unless there's a street sweeper, and there usually isn't, they stay where they dropped. In rural areas, the scent leans more manure chic. It's more bearable, but it never leaves you. You could scrub your hands raw, and you'd still smell the barn. Now here's a real historical fact to file away. By 1900, about 40% of Americans still lived in rural areas. That's nearly half the country pumping water by hand and reading by kerosene lamp. The other 60%? Mostly in rapidly growing cities where industrialization was turning everything. Jobs, technology, even death rates, up to 11. Want a strange little fringe fact? Here's one. In some rural homes, people would paint fake windows on the outside of their houses to make it look more civilized or symmetrical, even if the inside had nothing but empty walls or stacked hay. Why? Because symmetry was considered a marker of respectability. Fake it till you make it, right? Of course, living in either place came with risks. Cities had disease. Cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, all helped along by a complete lack of modern sanitation. You're bathing maybe once a week if you're lucky, and your drinking water might come from the same river you dump your waste into. Delicious. The country. Fewer people, but more accidents. Farming equipment, wild animals, untreated infections from stepping on a nail. Any of these could take you out. No ambulance, no ER, just whiskey, prayer and hope. There's a fascinating debate among historians about which life, rural or urban, was actually better back then. Cities had jobs, energy and access to education, but also slums, crime and child labour. Rural areas had space, food and cleaner air, but demanded back-breaking work and offered few services. Neither was comfortable, and both were relentless in their own special ways. You walk through the foggy dawn now, imagining what kind of person you'd be in this world. A butcher in a sweat-drenched apron, a tenant farmer counting every penny, a schoolteacher in a wool skirt grading papers by oil lamp. Or maybe you're a child, barely 10, already pulling 12-hour shifts at the textile mill while your parents desperately try to scrape together rent. Whoever you are, wherever you live, one thing is clear. Life is no stroll through the park. It's a determined blisters-on-your-feet kind of march. And yet, as the sun rises and spills gold onto the clappered porches and soot-streaked windows, you realise something strange. People are hopeful. They still dream of something better. A light bulb in every home. A wage they can live on. Maybe one day a toilet that flushes. Let's step inside, shall we? Homes in early 1900s. America come in all shapes, sizes and questionable smells, depending on who you are, where you live, and how lucky or cursed you happen to be. Whether you're stacked 10 deep in a city tenement or living on the prairie in a drafty clappered farmhouse, one thing is universal. Your house is not a place of comfort, it's a place of function, and maybe occasional rat sightings. Start with the tenement. You push open a heavy wooden door and walk into a narrow hallway that smells like boiled cabbage, soap made from lye, and humanity. The walls are stained yellow from years of coal smoke. Every step echoes off warped floorboards. Inside the apartment it's dim. There's one window and it doesn't open. The ceilings are low. The rooms are small enough that if someone sneezes in the kitchen, the person in the bedroom says "bless you" before the echo even finishes. No insulation, no heat, except for whatever you get from the kitchen stove, which probably runs on coal and is older than your grandmother. In winter, frost forms on the inside of the windows. In summer, the place turns into a brick oven. Roaches love it here, so do diseases. But hey, the rent is cheap, if you can keep up with it. Out in the country, things aren't exactly glamorous, but they are quieter. You walk into a farmhouse and are greeted by bare wood floors, walls covered in faded wallpaper, and furniture that's been patched up more times than anyone can count. The kitchen is the centre of the house, both figuratively and literally. It's where you eat, cook, sew, gossip, and, in colder months, try not to freeze to death. If the stove goes out in January, so might you. The bedroom situation is fluid. Kids share beds, or even sleep head to toe to conserve warmth. Parents have their own room, if space allows, usually right off the kitchen. Privacy? Even using the chamber pot involves a certain performance anxiety. If you want to take a real bath, you'd better start boiling water now. You'll need several pots just to fill the basin halfway. Oh, and you go first. Everyone else uses your bathwater after you. Hope you're the oldest. One real historical fact that hits hard. By 1900, less than 10% of American homes had electricity. That's right. Light comes from candles, kerosene lamps, or, if you're fancy, gas lighting which occasionally explodes and sets your curtains on fire. Want to cook dinner? It's wood or coal, baby. You keep your stove hot and your firewood dry, or you go hungry. Want cold milk? Dig a hole in the ground and store it there. Or use a literal icebox with a melting block of ice delivered once a week. Let's peek inside one of those wealthier homes for contrast, just for fun and maybe jealousy. If you're part of the urban upper class, your house might be a brownstone with high ceilings, intricate woodwork and heavy velvet drapes. You might have indoor plumbing, a flush toilet that sounds like a rushing waterfall, thrilling and terrifying all at once. You might have a dumbwaiter, decorative china you're not allowed to touch, and rugs so thick you could disappear in them. But even the rich deal with the same drafty architecture, unpredictable heating, and general inconvenience. It's not like the Roombas are doing the vacuuming yet. The household staff, if you have one, manages all the cleaning, cooking and laundry, which, let's be clear, involves heating giant tubs of water, scrubbing clothes by hand, and drying them outside year-round. And that's where the fringe fact comes in. Some rural families literally wallpapered their homes using old newspaper pages. Yep, print was cheaper than paint or wallpaper, and so entire rooms were covered in headlines and random ads. Imagine staring at a classified listing for snake oil miracle cure while you eat your stew. It's cosy, in a very specific ink-smudged way. Of course, not everyone has even this much. For many black Americans in the South, indigenous families pushed onto reservations, and recent immigrants in overcrowded neighbourhoods, housing was barely distinguishable from survival shelters. Dirt floors weren't uncommon. Leaky roofs, collapsing porches and shared outhouses were all part of the deal. There were no housing codes, no inspections, no safety nets. If the wall collapsed in the middle of the night, you just propped it back up with a broom and hoped it didn't rain. There's a scholarly debate about how much early 1900s home life contributed to the spread of disease. Was it poor sanitation, overcrowding, the design of the homes themselves, or just the fact that people didn't know germs were a thing you should be afraid of? Historians still wrestle with how much blame to assign to the environment versus the broader systems that trapped people in unsafe living conditions. Either way, you'd better keep your feet off the ground at night. Rats are bold this time of year. You want to relax, but there's nowhere soft to sit. Most chairs are wooden, possibly with a cushion stuffed with horsehair. The couch, if you even have one, is stiff and scratchy. No recliners, no overstuffed sectionals, no Netflix. Your entertainment is a family Bible, a deck of cards, or a neighbour dropping by with scandalous gossip about the mill foreman's daughter. Lighting is minimal. Once the sun goes down, you better finish your knitting or reading fast. And reading itself. That depends on whether you had enough school to learn how. Still, the home is the centre of life. It's where meals are prepared, babies are born, loved ones are mourned, and every family argument takes place because no one can afford to storm off very far. Walls are thin, voices carry, every sound becomes part of the house. Laughter, crying, coughing, whispering. Over time, the house holds those memories like layers of wallpaper peeling back with every season, and despite the discomfort, the danger, the scarcity, these homes were full of life. They were loud, messy, joyful, tense, cramped spaces of resilience, a pot of stew bubbling on the stove, wet socks drying over the fire, a baby crying, a grandmother humming, a father shaking off coal dust, a child clumsily practicing letters by candlelight. You don't get the gleam of suburban ease or the sterile shine of modern minimalist design. What you get is lived-in, rough around the edges survival, and somehow a surprising sense of warmth. Now let's head into the kitchen, where the smells might be comforting, or horrifying, depending on who's doing the cooking and whether that beef stew actually contains any beef. It's time to talk about food. Not the curated avocado toast type you might recognise from your algorithm-fed life, but the real, gritty, elbow-grease meals of early 1900s America. And trust me, your taste buds might not survive this century either. If you're living in the city, your kitchen is barely more than a stove, a sink, if you're lucky, and a battered table with a permanent wobble. There's no fridge. What you have is an icebox, and it only works as long as the milkman or iceman shows up on time with your weekly block of slowly melting cold. You cook everything over a coal or wood stove, which heats unevenly, and gives your kitchen the ambience of a forge. Breakfast might be oatmeal, thick, greyish, and slowly cooked into a paste that could probably patch a wall if needed. If you have meat, it's usually scraps from a butcher, salted or smoked beyond recognition. Eggs are a staple, but good luck affording them every day. Bread is homemade, dense, and always slightly burnt on one side. Butter comes from a neighbour or the general store and tastes like it's seen things. In the countryside, the situation improves slightly. You have a garden, maybe chickens, maybe even a cow if you're one of the fortunate ones. Your breakfast might include fresh eggs, biscuits, molasses, or cornbread. You churn your own butter, which takes so long your arms go numb and everything is seasoned with, well, salt. Spices are rare and expensive. Pepper is a luxury. Cinnamon is a holiday event. If you want flavour, your best bet is bacon grease, saved religiously in a tin on the stove and reused for everything, including frying apples, cooking beans, or greasing a squeaky hinge. Now, dinner, or supper, depending on which part of the country you're in. This is usually the heaviest meal of the day, and often includes some form of meat. Pork, chicken, or beef, although meat is a flexible term in these times. Stews are popular because they stretch a little meat a long way. Toss in some root vegetables, maybe some beans, and you've got yourself a meal that feeds 7 and only vaguely tastes like sadness. If it's winter, you're eating pickled or preserved vegetables. If it's spring, you're celebrating the first fresh onion like it's the second coming. Speaking of preservation, let's talk about canned food. Because here comes your real historical fact. By 1900, canning was a booming industry, but safety standards were sketchy at best. Botulism wasn't just a Scrabble word, it was a real and present threat. You cracked open that mysterious tin of meat and prayed it didn't hiss. If it did, you might end up in bed for a week, or 6 feet under. But still, canned corn, evaporated milk, and something disturbingly labelled potted meat filled many a pantry. What about snacks? Well, you're not exactly ripping open a bag of Doritos. If you want something between meals, you grab an apple if they're in season, or maybe a piece of bread with lard and sugar. Kids sometimes sucked on bits of molasses or chewed spruce gum. Yes, actual tree sap. Candy existed, but it was far from Willy Wonka territory. Think sticky, chalky, teeth-breaking confections sold in paper cones from the corner store, which also sold pickled pig's feet and licorice root. Yum! Fringe fact incoming. In the early 1900s, people genuinely believed that eating too many tomatoes could make you sick or even insane. Some even called them love apples, and thought they were only suitable for ornamental use. So if your neighbour serves you tomato soup, maybe check if their last house mysteriously burned down. Let's not forget what happens when things go wrong. Spoiled milk? You drink it anyway. There's no use throwing it out. You just make sour milk biscuits or mix it into pancakes and hope for the best. Meat gone grey? Slap some mustard on it. Bread mouldy? Cut around it. The idea of food waste doesn't really exist because wasting food means you go hungry. And hunger in this time is not some dramatic skip lunch and complain experience. It's a slow, quiet, gnawing thing that hangs around the corners of your mind. Cooking is an all-day job, especially for women. Before you even start, you need to haul water, maybe gather wood, clean yesterday's dishes, kill the chicken, if it didn't escape again, pluck it, clean it, and then finally, get something into the pot. And don't forget the baking. You don't buy bread. You make it in bulk once or twice a week. Yeast is temperamental, and if your dough doesn't rise, your kids will still eat it, but only after loudly complaining. Eating isn't just about nourishment. It's survival, community, and sometimes awkward silence while everyone chews and thinks about how tired they are. Meals are family affairs. No phones, no distractions, just clanking utensils and the occasional knock on the table to hush a talking child. The kitchen table is where decisions are made. Gossip is whispered, and everyone tries not to fight about whose turn it is to fetch more water. But don't imagine every home has enough. For millions of people, especially poor urban families, Black Americans in the rural South, and newly arrived immigrants, food insecurity is constant. Bread lines are forming in some cities already. Churches and charities offer meals, but those come with sermons and side eyes. Malnutrition isn't just a medical term, it's a way of life. Rickets, scurvy, and other deficiencies creep in around the edges. There's a scholarly debate around the quality of the early 20th century diet. Some argue it was healthier, low in sugar, high in homegrown ingredients, free from preservatives. Others point out the clear deficiencies in vitamins, the high death rates from contaminated food, and the lack of refrigeration, which turned every meal into a microbial gamble. Even your fresh milk might have been cut with chalky water by a shady milkman looking to stretch his profits. And what about water? Good question. It's often drawn from wells, city pumps or public fountains, and it is very hit or miss. In many urban areas, the water carries typhoid, cholera, and a wide array of digestive nightmares. Boiling it helps, assuming you've got the time, fuel and pots that haven't already been used to wash laundry. Still, in the warm glow of a kitchen stove surrounded by tired smiles and crusty bowls, there's a kind of beauty to it. The food may be humble, but it's shared. There's love in every overcooked potato, in every scorched biscuit, in every cup of weak coffee served with apology and a wink. You won't leave the table full necessarily, but you'll leave feeling like you belong. All right, time to get dressed. And I hope you're flexible, because putting on clothes in early 1900s, America isn't something you do half awake with one eye open. It's a whole process, a ritual, a daily endurance test wrapped in buttons, layers, laces and more sweat than you thought was possible before 9 a.m. Whether you're male or female, rich or poor, what you wear says everything about your class, your status, and whether you're even allowed in certain buildings or out of them. If you're a man, you start with underwear, not boxers, not briefs. We're talking wool or flannel drawers, long enough to cover you from mid-chest to ankles. They itch. They cling in weird places. They smell suspiciously like the attic. Over those you pull on your shirt, usually white or cream, with a stiff collar that could slice through drywall. Tucking it in is a must. Then comes your vest, because yes, everyone still wears vests. Not to be fancy, but to keep warm and look respectable. Trousers are high-waisted and held up by suspenders, not belts. Belts are considered informal, almost scandalous. Like, who do you think you are, a cowboy? If you're heading to work in a factory or on the railroad, you wear sturdy boots and a heavy wool coat. If you're an office clerk or a banker's assistant, you throw on a jacket and maybe a tie that looks like it's been passed down since the Civil War. Either way, nothing stretches, nothing breathes. You move like you're wrapped in upholstery. Now, if you're a woman, brace yourself. First comes the chemise, which is basically a long thin cotton dress worn under everything else to protect your actual clothing from sweat. Charming. Then bloomers, which are not cute or optional but required. After that, a corset. Yes, that corset. And yes, it's as awful as you've heard. Laced tightly, it reshapes your entire torso, reduces your lung capacity by about 30%, and ensures that you pass out if you try to jog across the street. Historical fact check. In 1900, over 90% of women in America still wore corsets daily. This was not some fancy occasion-only kind of thing. You wore it to church, to the market, to milk the cow, to give birth. Some women even wore maternity corsets designed to accommodate a growing belly, while still squeezing in the rest. Comfort was not the vibe. Over the corset goes a petticoat or two, then your actual dress, which often has a high collar, long sleeves, and enough fabric to make a king-sized bedsheet jealous. Depending on your station in life, your dress might be plain and handmade, or embroidered with lace and stiff as armour. Skirts sweep the floor. You try not to trip, and just when you think you're done, nope, hat, gloves, boots. You don't leave the house without a hat. That would be like showing up barefoot to a funeral. Scandalous. Even children weren't spared. Boys wore little sailor suits or mini versions of their father's attire. Girls had miniature corsets, button-up boots, and stiff petticoats. No elastic, no zippers. Every piece of clothing is either buttoned, laced, or tied. Getting dressed could take 30 minutes or more, and laundry day was a medieval nightmare. Clothes were boiled, scrubbed on washboards, and hung to dry no matter the season. You wore everything until it was visibly dirty. Then you wore it a little longer, because washing it was a full-body workout. Fringe fact time. Arsenic was actually used in some green dyes for clothing. Yep, toxic dye. The richer the green, the deadlier the outfit. And let's not even get into the feather trade. Fashionable women's hats were often decorated with entire dead birds. It was so out of control that conservation movements actually began in response to the wholesale slaughter of birds for headwear. Of course, what you wore didn't just say who you were, it often dictated where you were allowed to go. Factory workers had uniforms or aprons. Domestic servants were expected to be clean, presentable and modest. Wealthy women might change outfits 3 or 4 times a day depending on the social event. You had your morning walking dress, your afternoon tea dress, your dinner gown, and your evening wear, and you didn't repeat them, not in polite company. Men in higher circles had it easier, but even they were stuck in a cycle of strict dress codes, tailcoats for evening events, morning coats for daytime formality, and straw boaters in the summer, because sweat happens, even to the upper class. Ties were serious business. The wrong knot could ruin your reputation faster than a scandal. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether corsets were truly oppressive or a misunderstood form of fashion. Some historians argue that corsets gave women structure, literally and figuratively, and allowed them to move in public spaces with a kind of social armour. Others argue, quite reasonably, that if your clothing cuts off your lung function, it might be a problem. Still, some women swore by them. They believed a cinched waist meant beauty, respectability, and upward mobility. The fewer ribs visible on an X-ray, the more fashionable you were. And as absurd as that sounds, it wasn't so different from what people chase now. Just swap whalebone for waist trainers and call it a Tuesday. And don't even think about sweatpants, not just because they didn't exist, but because relaxation was not an aesthetic. You dressed to be seen, even if you were just hauling buckets of water. Pyjamas, for those who had them, were proper nightshirts or dressing gowns. You went to bed looking like a Dickens character, and you woke up with that same scratchy flannel clinging to your dreams. For the working class, clothes were repaired over and over again. You darned socks, patched elbows, and let out hems for growing children. Hand-me-downs weren't just a cute family tradition. They were survival. Closets, if you even had one, held only a few pieces of clothing. Sunday best was exactly that. Worn only on Sundays, cleaned rarely, and protected like treasure. And here's the kicker. Shoes were expensive. Like, very expensive. Poor families often shared a single pair between siblings or saved them for special occasions. The rest of the time, barefoot, through streets, through snow, through whatever the horse left behind. It builds character, they said. So now you're dressed, boots laced, corset pulled tight, hat pinned so hard it's never coming off without pain. You look respectable. You can now face the world, assuming you can breathe and walk in a straight line. Your clothing is both your armour and your burden. It keeps you warm, labels you socially, and quite possibly shortens your lifespan. So let's walk through a full day, start to finish, in your brand new 1900s life. Spoiler alert, it's going to be long, loud, and so physically exhausting you might need a nap just hearing about it. Forget your 9 to 5. This is more like 5 to collapse. No smartwatches, no alarms. Your body clock is tuned to sunrise, or a parent shouting at you to get up because there's already too much to do, and not enough daylight to do it in. You wake up just before dawn. It's still dark outside and the room is cold, like your breath is visible cold. There's no thermostat to fix that, just a cold stove and layers of scratchy wool. If you're in the city, you're likely crammed into a room with 4 to 10 other people. Siblings, cousins, possibly a stray neighbour. Privacy? Your bed might be a straw mattress, a pile of quilts on the floor, or something called a sleeping shelf, which is exactly as cosy as it sounds. You get up because you have to. If you're a child and you're old enough to walk, you're old enough to work. Maybe you head off to the textile mill, the matchstick factory, or the coal sorting facility. You carry your own tin lunch pail, usually filled with bread and maybe a boiled egg if your family's having a good week. You wear the same clothes you slept in, plus a coat if you're lucky, and shoes that may or may not have soles left. If you're an adult man, your destination depends on your station. Factory worker, prepare to inhale dust, oil fumes, and the collective hopelessness of hundreds of other men operating dangerous machinery for pennies an hour. Labour laws don't exist yet. Safety standards are laughable. You might lose a finger today, maybe 2 if your supervisor is yelling at you while you're running the belt press. But hey, you can always go back to work tomorrow, right? If you're a woman, your day starts even earlier. You've got mouths to feed, bread to bake, water to haul, and laundry to boil. Because yes, laundry isn't just throw it in the washer territory. It's a multi-hour event that requires muscle, patience, and an immunity to back pain. Then you might head out to work as a seamstress, a maid, or maybe you take in laundry from other families to make ends meet. After that, back home to make dinner. If you're a mother, your shift doesn't end until everyone's asleep and you've mended tomorrow's clothes by lamplight. Meals are brief and usually quiet. There's no time for a full sit-down breakfast. Coffee if you can afford it, maybe oatmeal or cold bread. Lunch, or dinner as many called it, is eaten quickly at work or at home and might be the only hot meal of the day. Supper is late, light, and often eaten in near silence due to sheer exhaustion. And always, somebody's still hungry. Let's not forget the kids. A working child's day begins before the sun and ends after it sets. Little boys work in coal mines, breaking lumps with pickaxes, crawling into shafts too small for adults. Girls roll cigars, pluck chickens, or assemble matchsticks, breathing in phosphorus that turns their skin green. There's no minimum wage, no child labour laws, no weekends. You miss a shift, you might lose your job. You get injured, you're just replaced. No questions, no compensation. Want a real historical fact that'll make your spine crawl? In 1900, over 1.7 million American children under age 16 were employed full-time. That's right. Your average 10-year-old wasn't playing with marbles or reading books. They were running machinery, hauling coal, or bent over sewing tables for 12 hours a day. If you were one of the rare kids not working, you might be in school, but only if your family could afford for you not to bring home a paycheck. School is strict, and corporal punishment is common. You sit straight, speak when spoken to, and recite your lessons by rote. There's no lunch break, you just don't eat. Girls learn to sew, cook, and do math. Boys get the same, minus the sewing and with more beatings. Homework isn't a concept yet, because the whole school day is work. Now here's a weird little fringe fact. People in this era believed fresh air was the ultimate cure-all. So much so that some schools had open-air classrooms. Yes, kids sat outside, even in the winter, bundled in coats and hats, trying to conjugate verbs while their ink froze mid-sentence. Education meets hypothermia. It's fine. Back in the adult world, you spend your entire day in labour, paid or unpaid. If you're lucky, no one in your family gets injured or sick. If someone does, there's no sick day, no healthcare, just a bottle of patent medicine and hope. Maybe you send the kids to the pharmacy to buy something labelled nerve tonic that's 90% alcohol and 10% wishful thinking. The workday stretches until the sun drops below the horizon. Factories close, not because it's time, but because the boss finally says so. If you're on a farm, the animals dictate your hours. Cows don't care if you have a headache. Chickens need feeding, fences need mending, and if a storm's rolling in, you're out there tying things down in the mud with your bare hands. Evenings are short. You wash up, maybe. Maybe you just collapse in your clothes. If you live in the city, you might stop by the pub or saloon for a beer and a chance to forget how much you hate your job. If you live in a rural town, maybe you sit on the porch and stare at the sky. There's no television, no radio, not yet at least. Entertainment is a conversation, a game of checkers, a neighbour's visit. Maybe someone pulls out a harmonica, maybe not. Then it's time for bed. Again, everyone shares. Kids in one room or on mats by the fire, adults in another if there's space. You sleep in shifts if you have boarders. You tuck a warm brick at the foot of the bed to keep from freezing. You pull the covers up to your nose and listen to the sounds of the house. Creaking beams, coughing siblings, the occasional scream from down the block because someone else just got evicted. Here's the open scholarly debate of the day. Was this level of work and survival just the norm for the time, or were people already beginning to feel the cracks? Some historians argue that Americans accepted this as their lot, driven by a Protestant work ethic and post-frontier survival instinct. Others believe discontent was already brewing, slowly fueling the labour and social reform movements to come. Whichever side you believe, one thing's clear, people were tired. Deep in the bones, no end in sight tired. And still, you get up the next day and do it all again. Because there's no safety net, no breaks. Just the sun rising on another day, another shift, another pile of coal, another loaf of bread to stretch between 6 mouths. You don't stop, you don't complain, not out loud at least. You just keep going. Because that's what life in early 1900s America demands. Your full, continuous effort, from first breath to final sigh, day after day. If you're lucky, and not needed to earn money, you go to school. But don't let your modern brain romanticize it. Early 1900s education is not the scented pencil, cozy classroom, show and tell experience you might be imagining. No beanbags, no flexible seating, no motivational posters about believing in yourself. Instead, picture a cold wooden room, desks nailed to the floor, a towering teacher with a stick, not for decoration, and silence so thick you can hear the chalk squeak before it breaks. Your school day starts early, just after sunrise if you're rural, later in the morning if you're in the city. But either way, getting there is a trek. In the countryside, you might walk 2, 3, even 5 miles to a one-room schoolhouse. Rain, snow, wild dogs, irrelevant. You're still going, or you'll get the kind of parental lecture that could blister paint. In cities, you might be closer, but you're dodging streetcars, horse manure, and the occasional fistfight on the sidewalk. You arrive, cheeks red from the wind or sweat, and take your place in a rigid row of desks. Boys and girls sit separately. Everyone's expected to sit straight, hands folded, eyes forward. The teacher, usually a woman if it's elementary, often unmarried because marriage meant quitting your job, commands the room with a presence that could silence a circus. She teaches everything: reading, arithmetic, geography, penmanship, history, and the mysterious subject called moral instruction, which is basically don't be a little criminal. Your books, if you have them, are shared, tattered, and frequently racist. The curriculum is unapologetically patriotic, highly moralistic, and often reads like someone wrote it while angry at children. You memorize facts, recite them aloud, and hope you don't mess up or you'll be standing in the corner holding a dunce cap or copying lines on a slate until your fingers cramp. Education isn't about creativity, it's about discipline. Here's your historical fact for the day. By 1900, 32 states had compulsory schooling laws, but enforcement was inconsistent, especially in poorer or rural areas. Many children, especially in farming families, attended school only during the off-season. In some communities, especially in the South, black children had segregated schools that were drastically underfunded, overcrowded, and often operating without even basic supplies. Some indigenous children were forcibly removed to boarding schools designed to erase their native culture. Classroom supplies are minimal. You have a slate and chalk, or maybe a few pages in a worn notebook. Ink pens are a luxury and usually shared. Mistakes can't be erased, only scratched out or ignored. Paper is scarce, so you write small, carefully, and make every letter count. There's no such thing as a colourful handout. The most visually stimulating thing in the room is the world map pinned to the wall. Faded, probably outdated, and proudly displaying the British Empire in all its red glory sprawl. Teachers are expected to manage students of all ages in a single room. That means 6-year-olds learning the alphabet at the same time that 14-year-olds struggle through algebra, or what passes for algebra back then. If you're one of the older students, you might help teach the younger ones. If you're one of the younger ones, you better not cry. No one has time for that. And yes, spankings are normal. Not as a punishment of last resort, but as a daily management tool. You talk out of turn? Whack. You forget your lesson? Whack. You breathe too loudly during spelling? You guessed it. Whack. Some teachers have a favourite ruler and they name it. It's not funny. It's terrifying. There's also the infamous soap punishment, where a student caught lying or swearing might literally have their mouth washed out with a bar of soap. Fun. Now, if you're in a city school, the class sizes are enormous. 40, 50, sometimes 60 kids crammed into a single room. Air circulation is a rumour. In winter, the heating stinks. In summer, the smell is unbearable. Teachers are underpaid, exhausted and frequently sick. Children pass lice, colds and whooping cough back and forth like trading cards. On a fun fringe fact, in the early 1900s, it was common for schools to run posture drills. Yes, posture drills. Kids were made to stand, sit, and even walk in military straight formation to improve character and moral spine. Slouching was seen as a sign of laziness, weak will, or possible moral decay. So if you're listening to this lying in bed, congratulations, you've already failed 1903 PE. Lunchtime, if it exists, is quick. You might bring a tin pail with some bread and jam, maybe a cold potato, maybe just go hungry and dream of cornbread. There's no cafeteria, you eat at your desk or outside on a log. If you spill anything, you clean it up or the teacher cleans you up, with a lecture and possibly more soap. The school year varies wildly. Rural kids often only go in winter and early spring, because they're needed on the farm during planting and harvest. Urban children might have longer school years, but they also have higher dropout rates. Families can't afford to lose a wage earner, even a small one. Many kids leave school entirely by age 12, sometimes even earlier, to work full-time. The dream of college? That's for the elite. For most, reading and basic arithmetic is the ceiling. There's a major scholarly debate over how effective this kind of schooling was. Some argue it provided structure and a foundation of literacy for millions of people. Others point to the crushing conformity, the suppression of critical thinking, and the blatant racism and sexism baked into the curriculum. One thing's clear: education in this era was not about nurturing the soul, it was about shaping the citizen. Now let's peek into the alternative. If you're a child in a marginalised community, say black in the Jim Crow South or Native American on a reservation, your educational experience is even more restricted. Black schools often have crumbling buildings, second-hand books, if any, and almost no funding. Native children are sent to government-run boarding schools where their hair is cut, their language is forbidden, and their entire identity is considered something to correct. Education becomes a form of erasure. Still, kids learn, they adapt, they recite, they practice their penmanship until their fingers ache. They read dime novels under the covers, they dream of something else, something beyond the dirty desks and cold slate boards. They whisper about the future, quietly, because whispering too loudly gets you swatted with the discipline stick. At the end of the day, the bell rings, or more likely a triangle is rung or a teacher shouts time, and you're released back into the world. Homework isn't assigned often, but when it is, it's expected to be perfect. No excuses. You trek home again, through mud, slush or horse traffic, tired but still buzzing with the leftover adrenaline from spelling drills and the fear of mispronouncing chrysanthemum. You arrive home, toss your schoolbook in the corner, and maybe, just maybe, sit down to read for pleasure. But probably not. There's firewood to chop, potatoes to peel, siblings to wrangle, and buttons to sew back onto your one good shirt. Still, somewhere in your mind, those multiplication tables and those stories about George Washington stick. Maybe you'll go further than your parents, maybe not. But you went to school. You sat still. You learned. And in 1900, that was more than most kids could hope for, so now you're sick. Or your child is. Or your back gave out because you hauled water, cooked over an open flame, washed laundry by hand, carried 2 toddlers, and still walked 3 miles to church, all before noon. What now? Do you call a doctor? Not unless you're rich, desperate, or a firm believer in bleeding as a cure-all. Because medicine in early 1900s America is, well, let's just say it's still mostly powered by hope, whiskey, and deeply questionable science. You start at home. You always start at home. First comes the poultice, something warm, sticky, and vaguely herbal slapped onto the affected body part. Got a cough? Slather your chest with goose grease and cover it with brown paper. Fever? A cold compress and a prayer. Stomachache? Whiskey. Toothache? Whiskey. Broken bone? Whiskey and a neighbour who once read about splints in a Sears catalogue. You're not looking for a miracle. You're just trying to stay ahead of death. Most people, especially in rural areas, won't see a doctor unless they absolutely have to. And even then, doctor is a generous term. Medical schools vary wildly in quality, and many towns have more barbers than physicians. A few good doctors are out there, sure, walking or riding miles to see a patient, carrying a black bag full of instruments that look suspiciously like tools from a shed. But they're the exception, not the rule. Here's your historical fact of the night. In 1900, the average life expectancy in America was just 47 years. For some groups, like Black Americans, it was even lower. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly high. 1 in 10 babies didn't live to see their first birthday. And the list of common causes of death reads like a horror show. Tuberculosis, diphtheria, pneumonia, typhoid, smallpox, and 1,000 other infections that today would be cleared up with a few pills and some bed rest. Hospitals? Oh, you don't want to go there. Not unless you're absolutely dying and have already said goodbye to everyone you love. Hospitals are seen as last resort death houses, often run by charities or religious orders. Cleanliness is optional. Nurses are overworked. There are no antibiotics, no IVS, no heart monitors. Surgery happens with ether or chloroform, if available, or just a bottle of something strong and someone to hold you down. You hope the saw is sharp. Anesthesia is more of a suggestion than a guarantee. If you're lucky, or unlucky enough to be near a large city, you might have access to a modern hospital. They're improving slowly, but you're still walking into a place where sterilization is new, and germ theory is not universally accepted. Some doctors still scoff at washing their hands. You, meanwhile, are trying not to look at the guy in the bed next to you, who may or may not be contagious with something airborne, and possibly fatal. Here comes a delightfully creepy fringe fact. One popular cure for tuberculosis, involved sending patients to sanatoriums in the mountains where they were encouraged to lie outside all day, even in the snow, breathing cold air to heal their lungs. They wore blankets and goggles and often froze their eyelashes shut. The success rate, questionable. The frostbite rate, surprisingly high. If you can't get to a doctor, and most people can't, you go to the pharmacy, or more accurately the apothecary or general store. And here's where things get wild. You can buy anything. Cocaine tooth drops? Sure. Heroin cough syrup? Absolutely. Mercury-based creams? Go for it. The early 1900s are a golden age of unregulated patent medicine. You've got tonics, elixirs, powders, and pills that promise to cure everything from baldness to tuberculosis, often laced with alcohol, opium, or just lies. And nobody knows what works. You drink a tablespoon of Dr. Whitmore's celebrated liver reviver, and maybe you feel better. Or maybe you hallucinate for 2 days and wake up in a different county. There are no ingredient labels, no FDA, no safety testing. Medicine is part science, part snake oil, and 100% buyer beware. Now, if you're a woman, things get especially dicey. Most doctors are men. Women who try to enter the profession face mockery, harassment, and financial ruin. If you have female troubles, you'll probably be diagnosed with hysteria, which is a delightful catch-all term that covers everything from cramps to actual mental illness to, let's be honest, just having opinions. Treatment, isolation, bed rest, sometimes surgical removal of your ovaries, or maybe just a vibrator, which was, believe it or not, considered legitimate medical equipment for treating hysteria. Awkward? Yes. Real? Also, yes. Midwives are still around, thank goodness, especially in immigrant communities and rural areas. They deliver babies, treat fevers, and offer herbal remedies passed down through generations. But they're often looked down upon by the emerging medical establishment, even though they're frequently better trained and more effective than the local doctor who thinks bleeding your child will fix his cough. One open scholarly debate from this period centres on whether modern medicine actually helped people in this era, or whether it introduced more harm than good through aggressive, unproven interventions. Some historians argue that home remedies and traditional healers saved more lives, while others point to early developments in medical science, like germ theory and antiseptics, as the beginning of real, measurable progress. Either way, it was a minefield. One wrong turn, one misdiagnosis, one infected splinter, and it could be the end. Dental care? I mean, sort of. You go to the dentist only when the pain is unbearable. Fillings exist, but they're expensive. Extractions are more common, and anaesthesia might just be a swig of whiskey and someone holding your head still. Dental hygiene is a mixed bag. People brush their teeth sometimes with powders made from charcoal or baking soda, but toothpaste isn't standard yet, and floss is practically a myth. Tooth decay is rampant. Bad breath is just normal. Mental health? Oh, that's not even a category. You're either normal or you're mad. If you're the latter, you get locked in an asylum where treatments include restraints, isolation, ice baths, or, if you're really lucky, a lobotomy. Depression, anxiety, trauma. These words aren't in circulation. You're told to pray more, get fresh air, stop being lazy. And yet, people survive. Somehow. They share remedies. They nurse each other through fevers. They light candles and sit by sick beds. They deliver babies on kitchen tables and carry water for sponge baths. They walk miles for quinine, scrape together coins for patent tonics, and whisper advice over fences and front porches. What works, what doesn't, what cured their cousin's rash. Because in 1900, illness isn't just part of life, it defines life. You carry it, you fear it, and you pass down the knowledge of it, hoping that maybe the next time you'll be ready. So how do you actually make money in early 1900s America? Well, short answer, with your body. Long answer, through relentless labour, back-breaking work, and the constant hum of risk. Whether you're in a factory, on a farm, down in a mine, or just scrubbing someone else's floors for pocket change, the unspoken rule is simple. If you're not working, you're not eating. There are no safety nets, no paid time off, no pensions, no unemployment checks. You work to survive, and sometimes you still don't. Let's start in the cities. Factories are everywhere now. Steel, textiles, paper, furniture, matches, cigarettes. If it can be made, there's a factory that'll hire you for pennies an hour. Most factory jobs are loud, hot, and so dangerous you don't really finish your shift. You survive it. You stand in one place for hours, doing the same task over and over until your fingers are numb or your brain checks out entirely. If you're lucky, the machine doesn't catch your sleeve and drag you in. You clock in early, maybe 6 a.m, and you don't leave until evening. There's usually no break room, just a corner where you sit on a crate and choke down cold bread. The noise is deafening. Giant presses slam down, belts spin, gears grind. You can't hear your own thoughts, let alone your co-workers' screams if something goes wrong. There's no OSHA, no HR. If you're injured, your replacement is already waiting outside the door. If you're a woman, your options are slightly more delicate, but still brutally hard. Sewing factories, laundry services, domestic work, packing plants, anything considered feminine, but still labour-intensive. You stand on your feet all day in wet clothes, pressing shirts or stitching seams for a boss who thinks a 5-minute break is an indulgence. If you get pregnant, you're fired. No discussion, no benefits, just gone. Men work in the heavier industries, steel mills, construction, tanneries and mines, especially mines. Coal is king, and the work is as miserable as you'd expect. You descend into a tunnel barely taller than a crouch, breathe in black dust and swing a pickaxe for 12 hours a day. There's no fresh air, no clean water, and if the mine collapses, well, they'll put a wreath outside and move on. That's if they even find your body. Here's your historical fact. In 1907, more than 3,000 American miners died on the job, making it the deadliest year in US coal mining history. Explosions, cave-ins, gas leaks. It was a gamble every single shift. And yet, men lined up for the work, because it paid slightly more than other labour and was steady, if you lived long enough to collect your wages. In the countryside, work is no easier, just quieter. Farming is still the backbone of America, but it's less amber waves of grain and more literal blood, sweat and tears. Small farms dominate the landscape. You plant, plough, weed, harvest, feed livestock, chop wood, and maintain equipment every single day. No weekends, no holidays. Just the ticking clock of the seasons breathing down your neck. A bad harvest means you don't pay your debts. No irrigation, your crops die. Equipment breaks, that's your savings gone. And the women on farms don't just cook and clean. They milk cows, churn butter, tend gardens, preserve food, raise children, and sometimes take over the ploughing when their husbands are injured or drunk or dead. Everyone contributes, even children, especially children. They feed animals before school, haul water, and learn early that the world doesn't stop when you're tired. It stops when the sun goes down, and not a second sooner. Let's toss in a quirky fringe fact. Some rural households supplemented their income by raising silkworms. Yep, they'd set up little boxes in spare rooms, feed the worms mulberry leaves, and harvest the silk by hand. It was tedious, delicate work, but it paid better than selling turnips. Barely. Now, if you live in a city and have a little education, or a good enough story, you might land a white-collar job. Clerks, stenographers, bank tellers, telegraph operators. These jobs pay modestly but come with less physical danger. Of course, they're mind-numbing in their own way. You spend all day writing the same figures, copying the same letters, staring at a boss who thinks you're replaceable, and he's probably right. But hey, you're clean, you're inside, and you don't come home covered in soot. For women, stenography is the dream. It's one of the few respectable office jobs available, and it pays just enough to give you a sliver of independence. But what's your reputation? You're expected to be proper, modest, and eternally grateful. If you speak up or complain about your boss touching your arm for the 5th time this week, you'll be out on the street before lunch. Then there's the street economy, where the desperate, entrepreneurial and criminal intersect. Newspaper boys, shoe shiners, street performers, pickpockets. You sell matches, flowers, or your labour by the hour. If you're an immigrant, you might peddle goods from a cart. If you're black in the segregated South, your options are heavily restricted. You're working as a sharecropper, a domestic, or not at all. And even when you do work, you're paid less than white labourers doing the same job. Sometimes half, sometimes less. And here's where the scholarly debate gets heated. Was industrialisation really liberating for workers? Some argue it offered stable wages, predictable hours, and the promise of economic mobility. Others point out that it dehumanised people, reduced them to machines, and concentrated power in the hands of a few tycoons who referred to their workers as hands, not people. The answer, of course, is both. It lifted some, it crushed others. Let's not forget how you get these jobs. There's no online application, no resume. You walk in, you ask, you wait. Maybe you bribe someone. Maybe you get lucky. Or maybe you stand outside a gate with 100 other men hoping a supervisor opens the door and points in your direction. If you get sick, injured, or simply can't keep up, you're gone. There's always someone hungrier right behind you. Still, people keep working. Because they have to. Because even a few coins mean dinner, or rent, or maybe enough to buy a warm coat before winter hits. You measure your worth in hours, in calluses, in how many minutes you can rest between shifts before the bell rings again. This is your work life in 1900. No flexibility, no passions, just survival, paid in nickels and sweat. And if you're lucky, really lucky, you live long enough to do it all over again tomorrow. Let's zoom out now, way out, and take a look at the parts of America most history textbooks use to politely tiptoe around or skip altogether. Because while the headlines of early 1900s, America were all about industry, invention and progress, there was also another America, millions of people living on the margins, not because they wanted to, but because they were systematically pushed there. We're talking about immigrants, indigenous peoples and black Americans, each carving out survival in a country that loudly promised freedom, but often delivered barriers. Start with immigration, because the early 1900s mark one of the largest waves in American history. Over 8 million people arrived between 1900 and 1910 alone, mostly from southern and eastern Europe, Italians, Jews from Russia and Poland, Greeks, Hungarians. Many land in New York, blinking against the sun and blinking even harder at the chaotic machine that is Ellis Island. Medical exams, name changes and questions shouted in English await them. If you cough the wrong way, you're on the next boat back. You step off that boat with a few coins, a cousin's address scribbled on paper, and maybe a suitcase made from an old flour sack. You don't speak the language, you don't know the laws, but you find your way into neighbourhoods where signs are in your own tongue, where food smells like home, and where someone always knows someone hiring. Maybe it's a sweatshop, maybe it's shoveling coal for the railroads. Either way, you work hard, hoping your kids won't have to. But the welcome mat is more of a welcome trap. You're viewed with suspicion. Too loud, too dirty, too foreign. Newspapers scream about the immigrant problem. Laws are passed to limit your access to certain jobs, schools, even housing. If you're Chinese, forget it. The Chinese Exclusion Act, passed in 1882, is still in full effect, prohibiting nearly all Chinese immigration and denying citizenship to those already here. If you're Japanese, you're treated only slightly better. If you're from southern Italy or Jewish Eastern Europe, you're called every slur in the racist dictionary and then handed the dirtiest jobs no one else will take. Here's your historical fact. In 1903, the US passed the Anarchist Exclusion Act, which allowed the government to deny entry to anyone suspected of holding radical political beliefs, including union organisers, socialists, and labour leaders. What counted as radical? Pretty much anything that challenged rich white power structures. Welcome to the land of the free. Terms and conditions apply. Now shift west and south to Black America. 4 decades post-emancipation and the promises of Reconstruction have turned into the brutal daily reality of Jim Crow. Segregation is the law in southern states. Black Americans are forced into separate schools, bathrooms, buses, drinking fountains, neighbourhoods. Separate but equal is the lie on paper. Separate and deliberately worse is the reality on the ground. Voting? Good luck. Literacy tests, poll taxes, and understanding clauses are designed to keep you out. And if you do manage to vote, you might not live to do it again. Lynchings are a constant threat. Public, brutal, and rarely punished. A man could be murdered for looking at a white woman the wrong way. A woman could disappear for speaking out. And no sheriff, no judge, no court would do a thing. Fringe fact, chilling but true. In some towns, postcards were printed and sold featuring photographs of lynchings. Actual glossy souvenirs of racial terror. People collected them, mailed them, kept them in albums. That's the America you don't see in the patriotic murals. And yet, amid the fear and injustice, black communities thrived in ways that rarely make it into the history books. Churches weren't just places of worship. They were schools, political organising hubs, and community safe zones. Black newspapers documented what white presses ignored. Families built businesses, created music that would shape the century to come, and raised children with pride and resilience in the face of systemic hatred. Now head even further back, to the original inhabitants of this land. Native Americans in 1900 are living through the devastating aftermath of conquest. The Indian Wars are over, but the wounds are still raw. The reservation system is in full effect. Entire tribes have been relocated, often violently, from their ancestral lands to places they never knew, with limited resources and little ability to sustain traditional ways of life. Children are taken from their families and placed in Indian boarding schools, where they're forbidden to speak their language, wear traditional clothing, or practice their culture. Kill the Indian, save the man is the policy in action. Generations grow up detached from their roots, punished for their heritage, and moulded into something white America deems acceptable. It's cultural erasure disguised as education. Here's the open scholarly debate. Were boarding schools an earnest, if deeply flawed, attempt to help native children integrate into a changing world, or were they a deliberate tool of genocide by assimilation? Most modern scholars agree on the latter. The trauma runs deep. The wounds are still open in many communities today, and yet, just like black and immigrant communities, indigenous peoples resisted. They preserved stories, rituals, language. They adapted, survived, endured. Elders taught younger generations in secret. Ceremonies were held away from the eyes of white officials. Every breath of culture preserved was an act of defiance. Meanwhile, back in the mainstream white America, these other voices are often painted as threats. Newspapers call labour movements foreign agitators. Black leaders are labelled dangerous radicals. Native resistance is called rebellion. The country celebrates its progress while ignoring who gets crushed underneath its wheels. And don't forget the role of gender in all this. If you're an immigrant woman, you're doubly marginalised. Expected to be the caretaker, the moral compass, and often the family's translator and negotiator, all while working yourself to the bone in someone else's kitchen or laundry. If you're a black woman in the South, your job options are maid, laundress, or maybe field labourer. The pay is insulting, the hours are endless, and the abuse, from white employers, the law, and sometimes your own community, is a constant risk. But despite it all, these other Americas form the real spine of the country. They build the railroads, harvest the crops, raise the children, cook the meals, clean the homes, fight for justice when no one's looking. And somehow, against the noise, the weight, the constant push to disappear, they keep going. Because survival here isn't just about food or work or shelter, it's about identity, about refusing to vanish, about finding ways to be whole in a country that keeps breaking you into pieces. So let's brighten things up a little, literally. Because in the early 1900s, the world is about to light up, buzz to life, and start sounding like something other than steam whistles and coughing. Welcome to the dawn of modern technology in everyday life, where inventions aren't just wild ideas in labs, they're slowly creeping into your home, your job, and your daily routine. Not everyone gets access, of course, and a lot of it still feels more like a magic trick than science. But one thing's for sure, the world is changing fast. First up, electricity. If you live in a big city, you might have seen an electric street lamp, or even had one installed in your building. That soft, eerie glow replacing gaslight. It's a novelty, and people don't trust it yet. Some believe it causes headaches or ruins sleep, but once you've read under an electric bulb and didn't have to trim a wick or avoid blowing yourself up with gas, you're sold. Kind of. That said, don't go expecting every house to be lit up like Times Square. The reality is that in 1900, only about 4% of American homes have electricity. That's your historical fact, and it's a telling one. If you live outside a city, forget it. You're still cooking on a wood stove, lighting candles, and using oil lamps that leave everything smelling like a shipwreck. Electric power plants exist, but the grid is patchy and wiring is expensive. Also, early wiring is not exactly safe. Your walls might be papered, yes, but there's a real chance the wires behind them could catch fire if you blink at them too hard. Now, you can't talk about electricity without talking about the telephone. It's been around since the 1870s, but by the early 1900s it's starting to feel real. You still don't have one in your home unless you're either very wealthy or running a business, but they're popping up in pharmacies, train stations and general stores. If you do have one, it's mounted on the wall, has a crank to get the operator's attention, and connects you to a switchboard manned, usually by a very bored woman plugging cords into holes while eavesdropping just enough to stay entertained. And then there's the automobile, a terrifying, glorious machine that smells like oil and ambition. It's noisy, unreliable, and constantly breaking down, but it's here. If you see one in your town, you'll probably stop and stare. If you ride in one, you're a rock star. Roads aren't ready for it yet, so driving is more like controlled bouncing over rutted mud paths or plank bridges held together with nails and optimism. Horses don't like them, and neither do pedestrians. But still, Henry Ford's over there tinkering away, and within a few years his Model T will roll off an assembly line and start changing everything. Fringe fact time. In 1903, a man named Horatio Nelson Jackson made the first cross-country car trip in the US. It took him 63 days, cost a fortune in gasoline repairs and hotel stays, and involved an actual dog named Bud wearing goggles. That's the kind of energy early automobiles required: persistence, money, and a little madness. Another marvel showing up in wealthier homes and commercial spaces: the phonograph. Imagine being able to listen to music in your house. No orchestra, no piano, no singing art required. Just a spinning disc and a big brass horn blaring out a scratchy waltz. People are obsessed. It's expensive, bulky and fragile, but it's the future. You invite neighbours over just to watch it work, even if the sound quality is about one step above a screaming tin can. In the cities, the upper middle class is starting to see other magical conveniences too. Electric fans, vacuum cleaners, which are massive and loud, and even washing machines powered by hand cranks or gas engines. None of them work well, but they're symbols of modern life. If you own one, you're bragging. If you use one, you're either thrilled or terrified it's going to explode mid-laundry. But the real sleeper hit of the era? Indoor plumbing. Oh yes, running water, sinks that drain, toilets that flush, baths that don't involve hauling 6 buckets from the well. It's rare, but growing, especially in urban centres. It changes everything, from hygiene to convenience to the way people design homes. Suddenly the bathroom is a room, not a terrifying shack outside you visit while carrying a lantern and your deepest regrets. Not everyone welcomes this tech revolution though. There's a debate, still happening in historical circles, about whether this technology genuinely improved life, or just widened the gap between the haves and have-nots. Progress looks great in ads and world's fairs, but for the majority of Americans, especially in rural or working-class settings, it's just a window they press their faces against. You read about electric irons in the Sears catalogue, but you're still heating yours over the fire. You see photos of fancy hotels with elevators, but you're still walking up 5 flights of stairs to your rented attic room. And this divide brings us to something creeping into American consciousness: the idea of convenience as class. If your home has gadgets, whether they're electric, motorized or automatic, you're not just comfortable, you're better, cleaner, smarter, more advanced. The new American dream is no longer just about land. It's about technology, having the newest, the fastest, the quietest machine that makes your life less miserable. We haven't even gotten to radio yet, because in 1900 it's still in its awkward science project phase. You can't turn a dial and hear baseball scores or war news. Not yet. But it's coming. Inventors like Marconi are experimenting with wireless signals. Ships are starting to use it for communication. And in a few short decades, the airwaves will be filled with voices, music, drama, propaganda, and the constant hum of America tuning in. For now, though, most people still live their lives unplugged. You wake up to the sun, go to sleep when the lamp burns out. You talk to people face to face, or by letter, or not at all. You sweep with a broom. You iron by muscle. You wash clothes like you're wrestling a bear. Your meat is stored in ice, your butter is churned, and your fire is started from scratch every morning. But there's a hum in the air, of things coming. You see it in the newspapers, at the World's Fair, in the catalogues promising that your life could be easier, cleaner, faster. That a better world is just a plug, crank or button away. So you hang on to your broom and your matchstick, but part of you starts to imagine, what if you could ride a car, listen to music, flush a toilet without checking for spiders first? The future is coming. You just hope it doesn't cost more than you'll ever earn. Now let's talk about the sweet, elusive concept of leisure. Free time, entertainment, the joy of doing something, anything, other than work, survive or collapse, face first onto your straw mattress. In the early 1900s, the idea of fun is undergoing a bit of a revolution. Sure, most people are still too busy being exhausted or ill to really indulge in anything grand, but cracks are forming in the relentless grind of survival. People are starting to make space, tiny, precious pockets, for laughter, music, sport, and the occasional ghost in a parlour. If you live in a city, you're in luck, relatively speaking. Urban centres are beginning to build actual entertainment districts, and you, tired and slightly underpaid as you are, now have options. Vaudeville is king. Cheap, live variety shows with slapstick comedians, opera singers, trained dogs, strongmen, contortionists, and dramatic sketches. Each act lasts just long enough to keep you distracted from the fact that you can't afford rent. The theatres are packed. The air smells like smoke and popcorn grease. You laugh, whistle, gasp, and maybe even forget your sore feet for an hour or two. On the street outside, there's music. Maybe a ragtime band playing outside a beer hall. Maybe a man with a hurdy-gurdy and a trained monkey. Maybe a woman selling hand-printed poems about heartbreak and factory life for a nickel. Entertainment in the city comes at you from all sides. Raw, strange, alive. If you're a bit wealthier, or you're a teenager sneaking in, you might find yourself at a Nickelodeon, one of the earliest motion picture houses. Silent films flicker across the screen, backed by a live pianist pounding away to match the action. There's no plot, there's barely a script. But the novelty of watching people move, dance, fall down, or kiss on screen is electrifying. You stare, wide-eyed, wondering how they got the picture to move, and how soon you can come back. Out in the country, fun is slower, but not absent. Church is still the main social hub, and Sunday gatherings are equal parts worship and gossip. Potlucks turn into dances. Someone brings a fiddle, someone else brings cornbread, and suddenly you're two-stepping with someone you secretly like while trying not to trip over your own shoes. These are the moments rural folks live for. They're rare, precious, and completely homemade. Another rural pastime? Reading. Books, if you can get them, are devoured like candy. The Sears Roebuck catalogue doubles as a fantasy novel and a bathroom supply depending on which page you're looking at. Local libraries, if you're lucky enough to have one, offer novels, serials, and the occasional scandalous romance, hidden under the more respectable titles. Dime novels are huge. Think pulp westerns, detective stories, and over-the-top dramas involving stagecoaches, shootouts, and heroines fainting every 3 pages. They're cheap, exciting, and mildly frowned upon by moral crusaders. And yes, spiritualism is still going strong. That's right. People are into ghosts, seances, and speaking to the dearly departed. The late 1800s had sparked a huge wave of interest in the supernatural, and by the early 1900s it's basically a middle-class parlour game. Your neighbour might hold regular seances in her sitting room, complete with candlelight, spooky voices, and someone conveniently fainting just as the ghost arrives. It's part drama, part belief, part entertainment. Do people actually believe they're talking to Uncle Harold from beyond the veil? Sometimes. Do they also just enjoy the thrill of it? Absolutely. And here's your fringe fact. Ouija boards were being sold as parlour games during this time, not spooky tools of the occult, but something you might pull out after dinner with friends, right between charades and a game of guess which neighbour is secretly courting the widow Jenkins. No one really agrees if it's real or not, but everyone agrees it's fun. Creepy fun, but fun nonetheless. Now, if you've got a few spare coins and nothing to lose, you might head to a penny arcade, if you live in a city lucky enough to have one. You can see moving pictures through a viewfinder, test your grip strength, or play rudimentary mechanical games that make clunky noises and spit out tickets or prizes. It's noisy, smelly, and full of teenagers on the verge of rebellion. Parents hate it, kids live for it. And then, of course, there's baseball. The sport is exploding in popularity. Stadiums are being built, newspapers are printing game stats, kids are playing in alleyways with sticks and pebbles. It's affordable, it's easy to follow, and it's ours. A distinctly American pastime that unites people across class and culture, even if they're still sitting in segregated stands. You bring your own snacks, you cheer for the home team, you curse the umpire. It's simple, it's beautiful, it gives you something to talk about besides your aching back. Not into baseball? Try the circus. When a show rolls into town, it's a big deal. Parades, elephants, fire breathers, acrobats, you name it. Kids beg their parents to go. Adults pretend they're just taking the kids. The smell of sawdust, popcorn and manure wafts through the tent. It's loud, it's chaotic, and for just one evening your town feels like the centre of the world. If you're looking for something quieter, there's always walking. That's right, just walking. Strolling through town or the countryside, visiting neighbours, watching trains go by. It sounds dull, but remember, you don't have screens, headphones or constant sensory overload. A walk can be a meditative act, or it can be social, or romantic. A chance to escape your four crowded walls and breathe something other than coal dust. Here's your historical fact. By 1905, Coney Island is fully operational as a leisure haven, offering roller coasters, hot dogs, and bathing suits that scandalise the older generation. It's loud, bold, and slightly dangerous, and it marks a shift in American entertainment toward the modern amusement park, a place where you pay not just for entertainment, but for the illusion of freedom. You're still a wage worker, you're still broke, but for an afternoon, you're flying through the air, screaming your lungs out and eating fried dough. There's an ongoing debate among historians about whether this rise of commercial entertainment was a good thing. Did it offer true relief from the crushing pressures of daily life, or was it a cleverly marketed distraction, keeping workers entertained enough not to revolt? Probably both. But either way, people embraced it. They needed it. Laughter, music, dancing, even a creepy séance in Aunt Clara's parlour. It all helped chip away at the exhaustion of existing. So yes, early 1900s America was hard, brutal even. But people still found ways to live, to gather, to flirt, to laugh until their stomachs hurt. Because even when the world is crushing you, a nickel ticket to a silent film or a fiddle at a barn dance can make you feel human again. So the calendar flips to a holiday. Finally, something to look forward to, right? Well, that depends. In early 1900s America, holidays are less about vacation and more about tradition, community, and occasionally fire hazards. You don't get time off from work unless your boss feels generous, or your factory burns down again. And even then, you're likely spending the day cooking, cleaning, wrangling relatives, or enduring a sermon. That said, holidays are still cherished, a rare opportunity to dress up, slow down, and eat something other than potatoes and regrets. Let's start with Christmas, because it's the big one. By 1900, it's evolved from a solemn religious affair into something that looks suspiciously familiar. Families put up trees, real ones, chopped down with actual axes, decorated with handmade ornaments, strings of popcorn, and, yes, real candles. Just imagine what a great idea open flames on dry pine trees in wooden houses filled with curtains and children must have seemed like. It's all very cosy until someone yells, "Fire!" and flings a bowl of gravy at the tree. Stockings are hung, actual stockings, the ones you wear, and filled with oranges, nuts, maybe a peppermint stick. If you're rich, a small toy. If you're poor, a lump of coal isn't even ironic. It's just another heat source. Santa Claus exists, but he's still in his transitional era. Less jolly brand mascot, more slightly terrifying man in a robe with inconsistent beard energy. And no, there are no inflatable reindeer. There are actual reindeer in books, but your local grocer has a meat cart outside, so maybe don't get too attached. Then there's Thanksgiving, still riding high on its wholesome mythos of pilgrims and Native Americans sitting down for a friendly meal. Of course, the actual history is more complicated and bloodier, but that's not what most people are thinking about in 1900. They're roasting a chicken, turkeys are still kind of a luxury, boiling potatoes and making cornbread. Pumpkin pie is a thing, but it's homemade with hand-rolled crust and filling scraped from the actual gourd. If you're a child, your job is to churn cream into butter and not eat the sugar before dessert. Good luck with that. Thanksgiving isn't yet the national juggernaut it becomes later, but it's gaining ground. School children do little pageants in paper hats, reenacting scenes that are more fantasy than fact. Historians today debate the accuracy and usefulness of this version of the holiday, but in 1900 it's all about harvest, family, and hopefully not burning the biscuits. Now let's take a stroll through Halloween, which is still a weird mix of folklore, superstition, and chaos. Trick-or-treating hasn't really caught on yet. That comes later. But kids do dress up and go door to door. The goal isn't candy, it's pranks. Real, destructive, borderline felonious pranks. Tipping over outhouses, stealing gates, smearing soap on windows. If you're a homeowner in 1900, Halloween is less about giving out sweets and more about preparing to have your fence stolen by children dressed as ghosts. Meanwhile, parties are happening, especially in cities. People bob for apples, tell ghost stories, and try their hand at fortune-telling. One popular superstition: peel an apple in a single strip and throw it over your shoulder. The shape it forms on the floor is the first initial of your future spouse. Another: stare into a mirror at midnight by candlelight, and you'll see the face of your beloved. Or a demon. Either way, it's a party. Fringe fact alert: early Halloween costumes often included actual animal heads, like goats or pigs, worn as masks. Why? Because store-bought costumes didn't exist yet, and papier-mâché was for people with time and glue. So yes, if you stepped out on Halloween night, you might run into a child wearing a dead squirrel head and calling it fun. Sweet dreams. Other holidays round out the year, though with wildly different flavours depending on where you live and who you are. Easter is all bonnets and Bible verses. 4th of July is a no-holds-barred explosion fest. Fireworks? Check cannons. If you've got one, use it. Injuries? Absolutely. Safety protocols? Never heard of them. There's a strong possibility that your uncle will lose at least one finger before the lemonade's even poured. In rural areas, Independence Day is the closest thing to a true break. Towns hold parades with crepe paper floats and flag-waving children. There might be a baseball game, a barbecue, maybe even a brass band if you're fancy. If you're lucky, you'll see a hot air balloon or a homemade cannon demonstration that makes everyone scream and duck. Patriotism is loud, sweaty, and slightly terrifying. Then there are more solemn days: Memorial Day, Labor Day, Arbor Day, each carrying different weight depending on your community. Memorial Day often includes parades and graveyard visits. Labor Day, ironically, is only just starting to be recognised in the early 1900s, and isn't yet the end-of-summer grilling holiday we know today. In some cities, it's marked by protests or marches. In others, it's just another workday in a suit that's too tight. For immigrant communities, holidays from the old country are kept alive in tenements and neighbourhoods. Irish Catholics celebrate St. Patrick's Day with church and music. Italians host elaborate Saint festivals with parades and street food. Jewish families observe religious holidays in tight quarters, lighting candles and making do with what little they have. These celebrations keep cultures alive in a country that often wants them erased. Now, let's not forget the deeply superstitious undercurrent running through many of these occasions. Early 1900s Americans, especially in rural areas, still hold on to a long list of folk beliefs. Friday the 13th? Bad luck, definitely. Breaking a mirror? 7 years of misery? Spilling salt? Throw it over your shoulder immediately. Don't whistle indoors. Don't open an umbrella in the house. Don't rock an empty chair. And if a bird flies into your home, someone's probably going to die. Happy holidays. Your historical fact for this section. In 1907, Oklahoma officially banned the sale of fireworks during the 4th of July after a particularly explosive year led to dozens of injuries and multiple structure fires. That's right. People were so good at setting things on fire that entire states had to get involved. And here's the scholarly debate. Are holidays in this era truly joyful occasions or cleverly placed societal pressure valves? Some argue they gave overworked, underpaid Americans a way to celebrate, rest and build community. Others say they served as distractions, ritualized performances to reinforce national identity, class roles and gender expectations. Either way, people leaned in. Because the rest of the year was too hard not to, so you circle the date on the calendar, even if it's just with charcoal. You plan your outfit, you save up for a small treat, you sweep the porch, light the candles, bake the pie, and gather with whoever's nearby. You sing, you dance, you survive another year. And in the back of your mind, you whisper a little hope into the air that next year things might be easier, and if they're not, at least you'll have another excuse to set something on fire. Let's say something goes wrong. Maybe your neighbour's kid broke your window. Maybe your husband disappeared after payday. Maybe the new guy at work made off with your tools, your money and your last nerve. What do? You don't call 911, that doesn't exist yet. There's no centralised emergency system, no forensic unit and no protective services unless you count the neighbour with a shotgun and an aggressive moustache. Welcome to early 1900s law enforcement in America. Inconsistent, underfunded, and about as reliable as a wooden watch. Let's start with the police, who vary wildly depending on where you are. In major cities like New York, Boston and Chicago, police departments are becoming more formalised, more uniformed, and yes, more corrupt. Beat cops patrol on foot, swinging batons and making their presence known. They're supposed to protect citizens and keep order, But whether they actually do that often depends on your race, class, and how much you're willing to pay under the table. In working class neighbourhoods, cops are both feared and needed. They break up bar fights, chase pickpockets, and try to stop kids from setting off homemade fireworks in the alleys. But they're also known to look the other way, for a price. Prostitution, illegal gambling, and off-the-books saloons all exist with a wink and a nod as long as someone's paying. If you're poor and get caught stealing bread, you're in jail. If you're rich and steal from your employees, you're probably running for mayor. Here's your historical fact. In 1902, New York City's police department had more officers than the US Army. Think about that. More men with batons walking beats in one city than soldiers defending the entire country. And yet crime still ran rampant because many officers were more concerned with power than justice. Outside the big cities, law enforcement is more of a patchwork quilt held together with whiskey and bravado. Town marshals, constables and sheriffs cover huge territories, often with little training and even less backup. Their weapons of choice? Revolvers, fists and facial hair. There's no CSI team showing up with fingerprint kits. If someone robs your store, the sheriff might write it down in a leather-bound notebook, ask if you saw anyone suspicious, and then go back to playing poker in the saloon. In the South, local sheriffs are also the enforcers of Jim Crow laws. That means they're less about keeping the peace, and more about keeping black citizens in line, through intimidation, fines, arrests, or worse. Getting justice in this era, especially if you're black, indigenous, or an immigrant, is less about truth and more about power dynamics. If a white person accuses you, you're guilty. If you accuse a white person, good luck. Better have a full choir of witnesses and a lawyer who believes in miracles. Fringe fact time. In some towns, vigilante justice was not only common, it was celebrated. Local newspapers would print stories of mobs chasing down criminals and doling out frontier justice. Hanging trees were known landmarks, and in some communities the sheriff himself might join the posse. It wasn't just tolerated, it was tradition. So what about jails? Think overcrowded, unsanitary holding cells that smell like sweat, urine and despair. You're not getting fed regularly. You're not given a change of clothes. If you're a woman or child, you're thrown in with everyone else. Drunks, thieves, maybe someone who stabbed a guy over a card game. There's no rehabilitation, no mental health care. Just time, walls, and the slow erosion of your dignity. Meanwhile, crime is evolving. Petty theft, pickpocketing and burglary are daily occurrences, especially in cities where desperation fuels the hustle. But organised crime is starting to rise, especially in immigrant-heavy neighbourhoods. Irish gangs, Italian syndicates, Jewish mobs, all forming in response to both poverty and the need for protection from corrupt cops and rival crews. They run gambling rings, loan shark operations and protection rackets, often operating out of the same back rooms where your cousin plays poker on weekends. Prohibition hasn't officially started yet, that's still a decade away, but temperance groups are already shaking things up. The Women's Christian Temperance Union is on a moral rampage, pushing for dry laws in towns and counties across the country. Their message? Alcohol is the root of all evil. Their methods? Public shaming, protest marches, and sometimes straight-up destruction of saloons with hatchets. Yes, hatchets. Here's the scholarly debate. Did early policing create safer communities, or did it simply reinforce existing inequalities under the guise of order? Historians argue both. Some point to the professionalization of departments and the rise of criminal investigation units as signs of progress. Others highlight the racial profiling, class bias, and the fact that law and order often meant enforcing the status quo at the expense of justice. And again, it all depended on where you stood in society. For women, the system is doubly stacked. Domestic abuse? The police might shrug. Your husband can beat you as long as he doesn't kill you, and even then, the trial will question what you did to provoke him. If you're a sex worker and you're attacked, good luck finding an officer who cares. The courts are even worse. No female jurors, no female judges, and often, no female witnesses taken seriously. But justice does exist, sometimes. Neighbours band together, community leaders intervene, churches hold mediation sessions, women form watch groups, and newspapers surprisingly act as watchdogs, exposing corruption and putting pressure on crooked officials. In a few progressive cities, early social reformers begin pushing for accountability, training, and standardized practices. It's slow, it's uneven, but it's happening. And in between it all, there's still that one beat cop who knows every family on the block, who breaks up fights, helps lost kids, and checks on the widow down the street. He's rare, but he exists. Just as much a product of the era as the corrupt officer pocketing bribes from the local brothel. So when something goes wrong in your 1900s life, you weigh your options. Do you call the cops, or do you find your cousin, the one with the heavy boots and a flexible moral compass? Either way, you know justice will come, but it might be late, it might be biased, and it might involve a lot more shouting than you're emotionally prepared for. Because in this era, the law is less about right and wrong, and more about who's got the most power, the loudest voice, or the biggest moustache. Now let's get into the cage match that is gender in early 1900s America. If you're a woman, congratulations. You exist in a reality where your value is mostly defined by how well you cook, how modestly you dress, how quietly you endure things, and whether or not you've successfully landed a man who owns more than 3 pairs of socks. The rules are rigid, the expectations are sky high, and the choices? Oh, they're limited. Very, very limited. To put it plainly, your life path is pre-written in cursive. You're expected to marry, keep house, bear children, and die modestly. If you don't marry, you'd better become a teacher, a nurse, or possibly a nun. Basically any career that involves nurturing or silence. Want to be a doctor, a lawyer, a business owner? Sorry, that's a hard no from society. Unless you've got an uncle on the inside and a fortune to burn, you're going to have to settle for being very educated in embroidery and casseroles. From the moment you're old enough to walk, you're being trained for domestic life. Dolls aren't toys, they're practice babies. Your chores begin early. Cooking, cleaning, mending, laundering. Your education, if you get one, will be infused with moral lessons, hygiene lectures, and the constant reminder that a woman's place is in the home. The goal isn't to learn how to change the world, it's to learn how to bake bread without dying of exhaustion. When you hit your teens, the real fun begins. You're suddenly under surveillance, from your family, your community, even your church. Your reputation is currency, and one misstep, a skirt too short, a conversation too flirty, can tank your marriage prospects faster than a typhoid diagnosis. Chaperones become a fixture. Letters from boys are frowned upon unless they're already planning a wedding. And speaking of weddings, yours will likely happen early. Average age? Somewhere between 18 and 22. No pressure. Here's your historical fact. In 1900, only 4% of women attended college, and most of those were from elite families who could afford to let their daughters dabble in higher learning before settling down. Co-education was still controversial, and many schools either excluded women entirely or kept them confined to ladylike subjects like literature, home economics, or moral philosophy. Math and science. Don't be silly, that's for the boys. So what happens after you marry? Well, you belong to your husband, legally, socially, and economically. You can't own property in many states. You can't vote. You usually can't even keep the money you earn if you work. Your legal identity becomes an extension of his. If he's kind, maybe life is stable. If he's cruel, there's not much you can do about it. Divorce is rare, scandalous, and legally stacked against you. So you make it work. Or you don't, quietly. And motherhood? That's the default setting. Birth control exists, but it's sketchy at best and illegal in most places. You rely on whispered advice, home remedies, and maybe a sympathetic midwife who knows what pennyroyal is really for. You have child after child, often spaced close together, often with no recovery time. Maternal mortality is high. Miscarriages are common. Stillbirths are heartbreakingly routine. You cry quietly because grieving out loud might be seen as weakness. Now, if you're a working-class woman, and most are, you might also be employed, either in someone else's home as a domestic servant or in a factory, laundry or mill. That means you work all day for someone else, then come home and work all night for your own family. There's no break, no rest, just aching feet and the constant question of whether you remembered to soak the beans before sunrise. And don't think being white protects you from oppression. Sure, race brings its own brutal set of challenges, but white women in this era are also boxed in tight. However, the box for women of colour is even smaller and made of barbed wire. Black women, for example, are often forced to work, usually as maids, laundresses or nannies for white families, while also caring for their own households. The mammy stereotype is born during this time, loyal, tireless, nurturing and completely false. Indigenous women face both gendered and racial erasure. They're often targeted for assimilation. expected to abandon their cultural identities and adopt white, Christian domestic roles. Many are sent to boarding schools or missions where their braids are cut and their language is forbidden. They learn how to be good wives in a society that doesn't even acknowledge their personhood. And yet, there's fire. The suffrage movement is gaining steam. Women are organising, marching, petitioning and getting arrested. They're writing pamphlets, giving speeches and demanding the vote, even though the press mocks them as shrill, unfeminine and dangerous. Susan B. Anthony has already made her mark. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is still quoted. But new voices are rising. Ida B. Wells, a black journalist and activist, is speaking out not just for women's rights but against lynching and racial injustice. She's not welcome in all suffragist circles, which reveals a sharp and ugly divide in the movement. White feminism, even then, has blind spots. There's your open, scholarly debate. Was the suffrage movement truly inclusive, or was it a class and race-bound movement dressed up as progress? Many historians argue that while the movement advanced white women's rights, it frequently marginalised or outright excluded women of colour. Others point to black and indigenous women's own organising efforts, which ran parallel and often more effectively at the community level. Now let's talk fashion, because it reflects this dynamic perfectly. Corsets are still the norm, but the Gibson girl is in style, a mythical woman who's beautiful, intelligent and capable, but also still tied to traditional femininity. She wears towering hair, sweeping skirts, and walks that fine line between modern and modest. She's not real, of course. She's a standard, a pressure. Another impossible thing for women to aspire to while folding laundry and nursing infants. And what if you don't fit the mould at all? What if you're not interested in men, in marriage, in motherhood? Well, you keep it quiet. There's no language yet for LGBTQ identities in polite society. If you're a woman in love with another woman, you might live as close companions, and everyone pretends not to notice. If you express gender differently, you're labelled peculiar or unwell. There is no support, no visibility, just silence and survival. But despite it all, women are rising. They're writing novels, owning shops, starting newspapers, teaching, leading strikes, raising children and consciousness. The domestic sphere is still a cage, but some are learning to pick the lock. The revolution isn't televised. It hasn't even been invented yet, but it's happening, slowly, relentlessly. So if you're a woman in the 1900s America, your choices are narrow, your rights are few, and your path is steep. But your strength, your intelligence, your will, those are already making history, even if the textbooks won't say your name. Birth, marriage, and death. The holy trinity of life's milestones, no matter the century. But in early 1900s America, these events come with a unique mix of charm, hardship, superstition, and logistical chaos. They're all deeply personal and yet unavoidably public. Whether you're being born into a one-room shack, getting married in your front parlour, or laid to rest in a pine box, you're doing it under the watchful eye of neighbours, family, and the unforgiving rhythm of the time. Let's begin at the beginning. Birth. You're born at home. Hospitals are still considered risky, impersonal, and mostly for the desperate. Unless you're wealthy and live in a city with a new antiseptic maternity wing, your mother is giving birth in her own bed, surrounded by midwives, sisters, and possibly your curious older siblings peeking through the door. There are no epidurals, no fetal monitors, and no sterile gloves. There is hot water, boiled sheets, and probably a lot of yelling. One historical fact that makes this era real. In 1900, the maternal mortality rate in the US was around 1 in 100 births, and infant mortality was far worse. Nearly 1 in 10 infants died before their first birthday. Infection, hemorrhage, breech births, and untreated complications were all on the table. Midwives knew what they were doing, often more than doctors, but even the best of them couldn't prevent tragedy in every case. Birth was a miracle, but one that routinely ended in mourning. Still, when it went well, it was celebrated. Babies were swaddled, passed around, and promptly baptized if the family was religious, which most were. Superstitions swirled around newborns: never cut a baby's hair before their first birthday, never let them look in a mirror too young, always hang a horseshoe above the cradle. People weren't just cautious, they were terrified. Infant illness could strike suddenly, and once it did, there wasn't much to do but hope and pray. Now, if you survive babyhood, and not everyone does, you grow up fast. Childhood is brief. marriage is waiting, and it's not just an emotional milestone, it's an economic necessity. For women, marriage is often the only socially acceptable way to leave your parents' home. For men, it's about proving you're stable enough to support a household, even if support means two people surviving on barely one income. Weddings in 1900 are usually small and domestic. Only the wealthiest have grand ceremonies in churches with floral arrangements and full choirs. Most people get married at home, in the parlour, wearing their Sunday best. White dresses are becoming more common thanks to Queen Victoria's influence decades earlier, but they're still not universal. You wear what you have, you invite the neighbours, you eat cake that's dense enough to be weaponised. And yes, the idea of marrying for love exists. But it's not the only reason, maybe not even the main one. Families arrange introductions. Social standing matters. Religion matters. So does whether the other person owns land, has steady work, or seems unlikely to die of consumption within the year. Romantic notions coexist with hard economic math. Your partner is your future, whether you like them or not. There's an old saying from the time, marry in haste, repent in leisure. You've got few legal options once you tie the knot. Divorce is available, but frowned upon, especially for women. It requires proof of abuse or adultery, money for a lawyer, and a thick skin for the gossip that will follow you forever. Instead, many couples simply endure. Marriage is less about lifelong happiness and more about forming a workable alliance. Love grows, hopefully, and then, inevitably, death. Death is everywhere in the early 1900s. It's in the streets, the factories, the childbirth beds, and the homes. There are no antibiotics, no trauma wards, and not nearly enough understanding of what causes illness. So people die, suddenly, quietly, loudly, messily, in their beds, on their porches, in their Sunday clothes or work boots, and when they do, it's up to the family to take care of it. Fringe fact time, embalming became popular in the US during the Civil War, when soldiers' bodies had to be preserved for long journeys home. By 1900, it's becoming a booming business. Undertakers, yes, that's the term, are starting to appear in every town, but not everyone uses them. In rural areas, families still prepare the body themselves. They wash it, dress it, and lay it out in the parlour. Yes, that's where the term funeral parlour comes from. Visitors come to pay respects, bringing food, stories, and maybe an extra set of hands for digging. You're buried, usually within a few days. No cremation yet, that's too radical for most communities. Coffins are simple, some are homemade. Headstones are often shared or engraved by hand. Cemeteries are small, usually local, sometimes informal, just a few graves on a hill under a tree. If you're lucky, your name is etched in stone. If you're not, a wooden marker might have to do. And death doesn't only touch the very old. Children die often. Accidents take adults in their prime. Disease doesn't discriminate. And when it hits, grief is communal. There's no grief counsellor, no hotline. Mourning is structured, ritualised. Women wear black for months, sometimes years. Men tip their hats. Neighbours bring casseroles. Whole towns might attend a funeral, especially if the deceased was young or known. Death isn't hidden. It's part of life, visible, constant, and accepted in a way that would unsettle most modern minds. Here's your scholarly debate for this section. Was the communal, home-centred approach to life and death healthier for the human psyche, or was it simply the only option people had? Some argue that being close to the cycles of life gave people resilience and a deeper connection to their families and communities. Others point out the trauma of constant loss and the pressure it placed, especially on women, to handle everything from childbirth to post-mortem care without rest or support. And yet, somehow, life goes on. Babies are born, marriages are celebrated, and the dead are remembered with love, song and stories. Scrapbooks are kept, lockets of hair are preserved, names are passed down, birth, marriage, death. It all happens in the same house, often the same room. Your mother births you in the bed where her mother died. You're married under the arch your brother carved by hand. You're laid to rest in the same churchyard as half your family. In this era, life isn't segmented. It flows in one continuous, messy, sacred stream. And even in its hardest moments, there's something profoundly human about it. Real, raw, and shared by everyone, regardless of class or status. Because in the end, whether you're born in silk or burlap, whether you marry in lace or calico, whether your coffin is carved mahogany or pine, you're part of the same fragile cycle. And in the 1900s America, that cycle is honoured not with Instagram posts or hashtags, but with hands, voices, prayers, and the quiet strength of the living moving forward, one breath at a time. And now, let's talk about what really gets your heart racing in early 1900s America. Not love, not ambition, but disaster. Because if there's one thing this era is truly generous with, it's the sheer variety of ways to be absolutely annihilated. Fires, floods, collapsing buildings, factory explosions, contaminated water, horse-related accidents, and the occasional plague. Take your pick. It's like the Grim Reaper opened a gift shop and gave everyone a complimentary souvenir just for showing up. Let's start with fire. In an age of open flames, wood-framed houses, and flammable everything, fire is a daily threat. You light your stove wrong. Fire. Your neighbour knocks over an oil lamp. Fire. Your kid forgets to blow out the candle he used to find the chamber pot in the dark. Fire. It's relentless. Whole city blocks can go up in hours. You smell smoke, and your first instinct isn't to panic, it's to grab a bucket because you're the fire department now. And speaking of fire, here's your historical horror story. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire of 1911, one of the deadliest industrial disasters in American history. It technically happens a little later than our 1900s focus, but the working conditions leading up to it are already fully in place by the turn of the century. Picture this: a textile factory in New York's Greenwich Village, filled with young immigrant women working in cramped rows. The doors are locked to prevent theft fire breaks out. The fire escape collapses. Dozens leap from the 9th floor. 146 people die, most of them women. It shakes the country, but only after decades of similar smaller tragedies have gone largely ignored. If fire doesn't get you, water might. Floods are common, especially in the South and Midwest, where rivers are unpredictable, and storm drainage is more theory than practice. Entire towns can vanish under a wall of water after heavy rain or a dam failure. There's no FEMA, no insurance, just soggy boots, lost lives, and everything you own floating downstream past your neighbour's cow. And if you're thinking, well, I'll just live in a nice dry apartment and avoid the elements, may I introduce you to the ever-popular building collapse? In cities, housing is being thrown up fast to meet demand. Cheap lumber, cheap labour, and even cheaper oversight. Tenement buildings groan under the weight of too many people. Floors buckle, balconies give out. If you're lucky, it happens during the day. If you're not, you're asleep when the ceiling caves in. Factories are no safer. In fact, they might be worse. Machines are poorly maintained. Ventilation is a joke. Explosions from coal dust, gas leaks, or just general human error are not rare. One man forgets to close a valve and suddenly the entire shoe factory is rubble. You hope your loved one wasn't on the morning shift. Or maybe you just walk past the site and whisper a quick prayer that it's not your building next. Fringe fact time. In 1904, the General Slocum disaster shocked the nation. A steamship carrying mostly German-American families on a church outing caught fire on New York's East River. Life vests were filled with rotting cork. Lifeboats were nailed to the deck. Over 1,000 people died, mostly women and children. For decades, the East Side's German community never fully recovered. And yet, national reform didn't follow. Tragedy was noted, but not always acted upon. Oh, and let's not forget disease. We covered medicine earlier, but it bears repeating here. Contaminated water is a full-blown killer. In cities, sewage and drinking water often share the same river. Fun. Cholera and typhoid outbreaks can wipe out entire neighbourhoods. Your neighbour looks fine on Tuesday, and by Friday he's a corpse. Public health systems are still crawling toward modernity. Milk isn't always pasteurised. Measles and smallpox are still common. You avoid people with a look about them, but really there's no escaping it. Your immune system better be made of steel and prayers. You also get smaller, weirder disasters. Horses panic and bolt through crowds. People fall into open manholes. Chimneys collapse. Outhouses tip over in windstorms, sometimes with people inside. Children disappear down wells. You can die from drinking bad cider, from eating spoiled meat, from stepping on a nail and letting it fester. Everything's out to get you. And your first line of defence? Common sense. Your second line? A suspicious stare and a lucky coin in your pocket. There's a scholarly debate about how these constant threats affected the national psyche. Did early Americans become more resilient, having to live with death and danger as part of daily life? Or did it breed fear, superstition, and resignation. Some argue that the rise of spiritualism, reform movements, and civic activism all trace back to these ever-present dangers. Others suggest it just taught people to compartmentalize, because if you really stopped to think about how many ways you could die before dinner, you'd never get out of bed. And don't think the government's going to help you either. If your factory burns down, if your building collapses, if your town floods, you might get a mention in the newspaper, a few donations from local churches, maybe a sympathy sermon. But federal response? Federal anything? That's a future luxury. Right now, you're on your own. You dig the graves. You rebuild with your bare hands. You carry your grief quietly, because tomorrow the mill reopens, and if you're not there, someone else will be. Yet somehow, people endure. They rebuild over and over. Families who lose homes take in relatives. Churches become shelters. Children collect pennies for neighbours who've lost everything. It's not about bouncing back. It's about pushing forward, splinters in your hands and soot on your face. You develop a sort of sixth sense, always checking the stove before bed, always sniffing the milk, always listening for the creak of a loose beam or the sound of thunder upstream. Not paranoid, just prepared. Because when disaster strikes, there's no warning, no mercy, and no time to hesitate. Still, you hope. You light a candle, knowing full well it could kill you in your sleep. You send your child off to work, praying they'll come home with all their fingers. You drink water from the pump and convince yourself it tastes fine. Because if you let the danger stop you, you stop living. And in early 1900s America, survival isn't just about escaping disaster. It's about walking straight through it, soot-covered and unbroken. So let's pull back the lens and talk about the deep, jagged fault lines running through early 1900s America. Race, class, and the elusive American dream. It's a time of incredible ambition and opportunity, but also one of systemic exclusion. And while the newspapers print stories about invention, progress, and the land of promise, the truth is a whole lot messier. The so-called dream isn't free, and it certainly isn't fair. Who gets a piece of it? That depends almost entirely on where you were born, what you look like, and how much society has already decided you're worth. Let's start with class, because that's the one nearly everyone feels. America in 1900 is a capitalist steam engine running at full speed, and most people are tied to the tracks. The Gilded Age has just ended, and with it came tycoons who made more money than entire countries while paying their workers starvation wages. You know the names: Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, industrial kings, philanthropists if you believe the press, exploiters if you've ever worked in one of their factories. If you're part of the elite, life is indulgent beyond reason. You have servants, summer homes, velvet wallpaper. You throw dinner parties that require printed menus and 10-course meals. Your children are tutored in Latin and ride ponies for exercise. You travel by train, first class, and complain about the upholstery. You don't worry about illness, hunger, or rent. You worry about gossip columns and which fork to use for the fish course. Meanwhile, if you're working class, your entire life is built around staying alive. You count pennies. You mend your boots until the soles fall off. You work until your hands are permanently calloused, and your back gives out before 40. You don't have time to worry about ambition. You're too busy worrying whether your landlord's going to raise the rent, or whether the next cough in your household will be the one that takes somebody out. Class mobility. It exists, but it's rare. The American dream promises you can make it if you work hard, but the reality is more like, you can maybe survive if you never get sick, never lose your job, and never tick off the wrong boss. A few people escape the grind through luck or genius or inheritance. Most don't. They work until they die, then get replaced. Now lay a race over that, and the picture gets even grimmer. The colour of your skin doesn't just affect your opportunities, it defines them. If you're black in the 1900s America, you're living under a system of legal segregation in the South, and de facto discrimination everywhere else. Jim Crow laws govern your every move. You can't use the same water fountains, the same schools, the same train cars as white people. You're paid less. You're denied loans. You're excluded from unions. And if you protest, you might not live to tell the story. Lynchings aren't just common. They're often public events, attended like twisted festivals. The press rarely reports the truth, and the law almost never intervenes. Despite that, black communities endure, and even thrive where they can. Churches are strongholds. Black-owned businesses, newspapers, and schools begin to carve out space. Families support one another in tight-knit neighbourhoods. Leaders like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois emerge, offering different visions for advancement. One focused on vocational education, the other on political and academic equality. The debate between them becomes a cornerstone of early 20th century black politics. It's not just a disagreement, it's a reflection of how limited the paths to progress really are when every road is a fight. If you're Native American, the situation is somehow even more tragic. Your land has been taken, your people forcibly relocated, and your children placed in boarding schools meant to strip them of their identity. You're not yet considered a citizen. You don't get to vote. You are, in the eyes of federal policy, a problem to be managed, not a people to be respected. And yet tribal cultures persist, in quiet resistance, in language, in ceremony, in memory. It's survival under siege. If you're Asian, especially Chinese or Japanese, you face exclusion, scapegoating, and outright bans on immigration. The Chinese Exclusion Act has made it almost impossible to bring family over or gain citizenship. You work the hardest jobs for the lowest pay, and you're blamed for economic problems you didn't create. White Americans call you unassimilable, while simultaneously relying on your labour to build railroads, cook meals, and clean hotels. And then there are the new waves of European immigrants, Italians, Jews, Poles, Greeks, despised by earlier immigrants who now see themselves as the real Americans. These newcomers are mocked, attacked, and shoved into the worst housing and jobs, but their skin colour gives them an edge others don't get. Over generations, they'll become white, at great cost. But in 1900, they're still seen as foreign, suspect, and inferior. Fringe fact: scientific racism is a very real and very respected field during this time. Educated men in lab coats are out here measuring skulls and writing treatises on why some races are biologically superior to others. It's fake science, obviously, but it's used to justify everything from segregation to sterilization. Yes, forced sterilization programs targeting poor women, especially women of colour, begin taking root during this period under the banner of eugenics. And here's where the scholarly debate kicks in. Was the American dream ever truly meant for everyone? Or was it always an exclusive club dressed up as universal opportunity? Some historians argue that the dream was aspirational but corruptible, a good idea twisted by greed and power. Others say the dream was only ever real for a narrow band of people, and everyone else was sold a myth while being used as labour. The truth probably lives somewhere in the middle. For millions, especially immigrants, the dream meant escaping worse conditions in their home countries. Owning land, learning English, sending a child to school, that was progress, even if the system was rigged. For black families fleeing the terror of the Deep South, moving north meant a small measure of freedom, even if they traded one kind of oppression for another. The dream for many wasn't wealth, it was dignity, stability, safety. But still the ladder was there, and most of it was missing rungs. The climb was hard and some were told not to climb at all. And yet, people did. They organised, they marched, they published, they built schools, they formed unions, they passed down stories, they fought for their children to have more than they did. Even when the system said no, they found a way to keep hoping for yes. Because the American dream wasn't just a promise, it was a challenge. And no matter how rigged the game was, no matter how often the rules changed, people kept playing. They still do. So let's crack open the national brain of early 1900s America and take a long, slow look at what people actually believed. Not just in terms of religion or superstition, but in politics, science, society, and how the future was supposed to unfold. Because behind all the soot and corsets, this is a time when Americans are trying to make sense of a rapidly changing world. The pace of progress is dizzying, and everyone's got an opinion, some rooted in optimism, others in fear, and many in the kind of logic that today would get you laughed out of a high school debate club. Let's start with science, which is having its moment, but still feels like a shiny new toy more than a trusted authority. People are reading about germ theory, electricity, and the wonders of the human body, but that doesn't mean they all believe it. For many, especially in rural areas, science is viewed as useful, but also suspicious, vaguely unholy, or just too fancy to trust. Medicine is still mostly homegrown. Electricity might give you headaches. Vaccines, controversial, pasteurization, sounds like witchcraft. You'll hear plenty of people say, My granddaddy lived to be 80 without all that science nonsense, while coughing into a handkerchief that definitely should have been burned weeks ago. Still, newspapers are packed with glowing tales of progress, flying machines, telegraphs, and stories about scientists who might one day figure out how to talk to Mars. The public is fascinated, even when they don't fully understand what they're reading. Scientific language is seeping into daily life. Ads promise electrotonic treatments, vibrational health therapy, or scientifically tested beauty creams. Spoiler, most of these are snake oil in a fancy bottle. But if the label says scientific, people trust it just a little more. And then there's politics, which, much like today, is a mess. People believe in the Constitution, in the Founding Fathers, and in the concept of democracy, but they're also deeply skeptical of their leaders. Corruption is rampant, especially in city governments run by political machines like Tammany Hall in New York. If you want a job, a permit, or just the street outside your home paved, it's not about voting. It's about knowing the right person and slipping them the right envelope. Presidents of the era are seen more as distant figureheads than everyday leaders. William McKinley, elected in 1896 and assassinated in 1901, is considered steady but uninspiring. Teddy Roosevelt, who follows, is another story, brash, loud, and beloved by many for his energy and bold ideas. People admire strength, plain speech, and action, but they also fear the federal government getting too strong. There's a real tension between wanting help, better roads, safer factories, and wanting to be left alone. Your average citizen believes government can work, but only if kept in check. This is a time of muckraking journalism, where writers like Ida Tarbell and Upton Sinclair expose the rot under the surface, monopolies, unsafe meatpacking plants, child labour. People believe these things are wrong, but also kind of inevitable. Change feels possible, but also distant, wrapped in red tape and resistance. On the social front, opinions are even more chaotic. The public is deeply divided on issues like immigration, race, women's rights, and labour laws. If you're white and middle class, you might believe your way of life is the American standard everyone should aspire to. If you're a progressive, you might push for reforms, shorter workdays, better schools, voting rights for women. If you're conservative, you might see those things as threats to order, family and tradition. One historical fact that captures this tension. In 1900, more than half the states in the US still barred women from voting, and the ones that allowed it were mostly out west. People feared that letting women into the political sphere would weaken national character, or distract them from their duties at home. Newspapers ran cartoons mocking suffragists as mannish, nagging, or just plain hysterical. And yet the movement marched on, gaining traction because more people, especially younger ones, believed the future should look different. And then there's race, the elephant permanently parked in the national living room. Even those who opposed slavery during the Civil War didn't necessarily believe in racial equality. Many white Americans in 1900 truly believe in the concept of racial hierarchy, not just culturally, but biologically. Scientific racism is widespread, and eugenics is gaining ground as a respectable intellectual theory. Public policy is often based on these ideas, quietly shaping everything from immigration laws to school funding. Fringe fact? The World's Fair of 1904 in St. Louis featured an actual human zoo that displayed indigenous Filipinos in recreated tribal villages to show off the US's new imperial conquests. Attendees walked through and observed them like exhibits, convinced they were witnessing primitive life. That was considered normal entertainment for the time. Meanwhile, your average person believes the country is heading towards something big, the future, but no one agrees on what that future looks like. Some believe in technology, that machines will eventually end poverty and make work obsolete. Others are terrified of industrialization, convinced it's separating people from nature and God. Some see immigration as a threat to American values. Others see it as proof of America's greatness. Some want America to be a global power. Others want it to mind its own business and stay out of Europe's mess. There's an undercurrent of optimism, but it's laced with fear. People believe in progress, but also worry that too much change will lead to collapse. They trust institutions, church, school, family, but suspect those institutions are already under attack from modernity, foreigners, or just kids reading too many novels. And religion, of course, plays a huge role. Most Americans still attend church regularly and believe deeply in Christian values, but even those are starting to fracture under the pressure of new ideas. The social gospel movement is rising, promoting the idea that Christianity should address poverty and inequality, not just preach morality. At the same time, fundamentalism begins to take root, pushing back against science, modernism, and anything that smells like change. Here's the scholarly debate. Were Americans at the turn of the century more hopeful than fearful, or the other way around? Some argue this was a golden age of belief in progress, a moment when anything seemed possible, from flying to curing disease to building a better world. Others say it was an age of anxiety, with people clinging to outdated beliefs in the face of terrifying change. Both views are valid, and the truth as usual probably lives in the uncomfortable space between.
Yep.
Because in 1900, belief isn't just about religion or science. It's about how you understand your place in the world, where you came from, where you're going, and whether the things you build will last. And even though the voices are clashing, the fears are mounting, and the changes are coming faster than most can process, the belief in something, a better job, a fairer government, a more just society, still pulses quietly beneath the chaos. It's fragile, it's flawed, but it's there. And for millions of people, it's the only thing worth holding on to. So, you've been working, surviving, dodging fires, and navigating the social spaghetti of early 1900s America. But where are you actually living? Let's take a long, squinty-eyed look at the homes and neighbourhoods of the era, from crumbling tenements to sprawling mansions, because where you live doesn't just define your address, it defines your entire quality of life. And in this period, housing is a loud, in-your-face expression of class, status and survival. If you're poor, and odds are you are, you're living in a tenement, a word that sounds just fancy enough to hide how miserable it really is. Think 4 to 6 stories high, brick or wood frame, with dozens of families crammed into tiny rooms barely large enough to stand in, let alone breathe. The walls are paper thin, the staircases are steep and splintering, and there's no such thing as privacy. If you're lucky, your unit has a window. If you're really lucky, that window faces outdoors instead of straight into someone else's kitchen. Running water? Don't count on it. Most buildings have shared bathrooms in the hallway, maybe one per floor if the landlord's feeling generous. You wait in line to relieve yourself or take a sponge bath with a bowl of lukewarm water. Your kitchen is a coal stove, a chipped basin, and a shelf nailed into the wall. The smell? A potent blend of cooking grease, kerosene, and human despair, mixed with the faint, ever-present scent of mildew that never quite goes away, no matter how many candles you burn or prayers you offer. Noise is a constant companion. Babies crying, men shouting, radios blaring ragtime through thin walls, footsteps overhead like an angry tap-dancing ghost. Privacy isn't a thing. Neither is quiet. You learn to whisper, to ignore, to sleep through anything short of structural collapse, which, to be fair, is still a possibility. If you live in a company town, the situation changes slightly. Your house is owned by your employer, usually the local mine, factory or mill, and while it might be a bit more stable than a tenement, it comes with strings. Your rent is deducted directly from your paycheck. The store you buy food from, also owned by the company and conveniently overpriced. Your neighbours all work the same brutal job, and management lives up on the hill in a much nicer home with actual siding and maybe even painted shutters. You can be evicted for speaking out, organising, or missing work. It's not just a home, it's a leash. But let's say you've made it to the middle class, a teacher, a shop owner, maybe the manager at the textile mill. You live in a modest but dignified house, usually a row home in the city, or a folk Victorian in the country. Painted wood siding, a porch with carved railings, maybe a garden patch if you have space. Inside you have a parlour, the fancy sitting room no one's allowed to mess up, a kitchen, a couple of bedrooms, and a small bathroom if you've recently upgraded from the outhouse. Your furnishings? Modest but meaningful. A rocking chair handed down from your mother, a phonograph you saved up for, curtains that are clean even if they're patched. You might even have framed photographs on the wall, family portraits, eyes all fixed straight ahead like they're staring down time itself. This home, though humble, is your fortress. You mop the floors every week, you polish the banister, you hang lace doilies everywhere because somehow they're supposed to mean you've made it. And then we arrive at the other side of the spectrum, mansions built by robber barons, real estate moguls or industrial tycoons who treat architecture like a competitive sport. These are castles, basically. multi-storied behemoths with marble staircases, crystal chandeliers, imported rugs, ballrooms that no one even uses except for holiday parties and to make the staff nervous. The kitchens are massive, though the owners never enter them. There are servants' quarters, billiards rooms, sunrooms, even separate wings just for guests. The entire building is designed to scream one thing: I am important and richer than your entire lineage. Fringe fact time. Wealthy homes of this era often featured morning rooms, or designated spaces to hold wakes. These rooms were sometimes used more often than the dining room. Death was so common and so ceremonial that your mansion needed a designated area for it. Imagine being rich enough to have a formal grief wing. Regardless of wealth, houses share some basics. Heating is by stove or fireplace. If it's coal, you're shoveling it yourself. If it's wood, someone's splitting logs. In summer, you just sweat and hope. Lighting is transitioning from gas to electricity, but most homes still rely on kerosene lamps or candles. You go to bed earlier in winter, not out of choice, but because it's dark and there's no Netflix to keep you up. Walls are often covered in ornate wallpaper, floral, damask or striped, designed to impress guests and hide soot. Floors are bare or covered in heavy rugs. In tenements, the rugs are often nailed down to cover holes in the wood. In mansions, they're Turkish imports that cost more than an entire household makes in a year. And here's the kicker. Home ownership is still out of reach for most people. Renting is the norm. You live where you can afford, and afford often means not dead yet. Home loans exist, but terms are brutal. 30-year mortgages are rare. You either pay outright, take out a private note, or buy from the company store with interest that could drain your family's savings in a decade. If you miss a payment, goodbye house, hello tent. Now let's zoom out to neighbourhoods, because housing doesn't exist in isolation. Cities are split by class and race, not subtly. Immigrant neighbourhoods form tight communities, Little Italy, Chinatown, Jewish quarters, where people share language, food and survival strategies. These neighbourhoods are often the most overcrowded, the most policed, and the last to receive city services like garbage pickup or school funding. But they're also full of life. Music from open windows, street vendors hawking sweets, mothers yelling kids' names from fire escapes. Middle-class areas are quieter, tidier, and full of porches with rocking chairs and stern fathers watering lawns in suspenders. Wealthy neighbourhoods, often upwind and uphill, are gated. Not always with iron fences, but with expectations. You don't walk there unless you belong. If you're seen wandering too slowly, someone might ask you what your business is. Your historical fact. In 1890, Jacob Riis published How the Other Half Lives, a photojournalistic exposé of New York tenement conditions. The book shocked the middle and upper classes into realising that poverty wasn't just abstract. It had a face, a smell, and an address just a trolley ride away. It sparked some reforms, but also a fresh wave of moral judgment about how the poor chose to live. Here's the open debate. Did early housing reflect a natural social order, or was it artificially rigged by policies, discrimination, and exploitative landlords? Most historians today point toward the latter. Redlining, restrictive covenants, and zoning laws may not be official policy yet, but the groundwork is already being laid. Neighbourhoods are designed to keep people in place, economically, socially, racially. Mobility is possible, but the stairs are steep, slippery, and someone at the top is always stepping on your fingers. Still, your home is yours, however humble. It's where you cook, cry, celebrate, and hope. You hang a quilt on the wall, you sweep the steps on Sunday, you water the tomato plant in the windowsill and pretend it's thriving. Because in the end, even in a time when comfort is scarce and walls are thin, a home is more than shelter. It's a claim to dignity. It's proof that you're still here, still trying, still carving out your place in a world built to keep you moving but never settled. Alright, let's put down the coal shovel and lace up our imaginary walking boots. It's time to take a trip. Not a metaphorical one, but a literal look at how people in early 1900s America actually got from point A to point B without losing their minds, their teeth, or their luggage. Travel in this era isn't glamorous unless you're absurdly rich. For most people, it's a bumpy, dusty, loud, smoke-filled affair where you're grateful just to arrive in one piece and still in possession of your suitcase and most of your dignity. Let's start with the railroads, because if you're going any farther than across town, you're probably doing it by train. Trains are the arteries of the country in 1900. They connect cities, towns, and even the most rural outposts. You can board in New York and with enough time and sandwiches step off in San Francisco. It's a marvel of engineering. It's also loud, gritty and smells like coal, old leather and whatever your seatmate brought for lunch. The train classes are where things really get spicy. If you're wealthy, you're riding in a Pullman car complete with velvet seats, gas lighting and liveried porters who smile while secretly resenting everything about your luggage and your attitude. There's a dining car where you eat on real china with silverware that could double as heirlooms. You sip tea, you read the newspaper, you complain about the coffee while the Midwest flashes by your window like a sepia-toned slideshow. If you're not wealthy, and let's be honest, that's most of the population, you're riding in third class, hard benches, crowded aisles, your feet might be on a sack of onions. There's no dining car here, just whatever you packed yourself or bought from a vendor yelling through the window at each station stop. Your trip might take days, and sleep comes in stolen half hours as the train lurches through mountains, deserts and towns that smell distinctly like livestock. But despite the discomfort, train travel is revolutionary. It turns what used to be a 2-week journey by wagon into a 2-day adventure by rail. It connects farmers to markets, immigrants to new jobs, and families separated by hundreds of miles. It's noisy, but it's also thrilling. The country feels conquerable, at least from the window of a moving train. If you're staying closer to home, streetcars and trolleys are your best bet. In cities, these run on electric lines, clanging their bells as they rumble down streets crowded with horses, pedestrians, and a truly irresponsible number of unattended children. Streetcars are cheap, just a few cents, and mostly reliable, unless there's a strike, a derailment, or a horse falls into the tracks again. You jump on from the rear, drop your coin into the conductor's box and find a seat next to a sweaty stranger holding a fish in a sack. And yes, there are cars, but not many. In 1900, there are only about 8,000 automobiles in the entire country. They're rare, expensive, and basically glorified lawnmowers with leather seats and a death wish. Roads are mostly dirt, so you're guaranteed to get stuck, especially after rain. There are no traffic laws yet, which means people drive however they want. Fast, slow, or with a cigar in one hand and a goat in the passenger seat. Here's a historical fact. In 1903, Horatio Nelson Jackson became the first person to drive a car across the United States, San Francisco to New York, in a journey that took him 63 days, cost him $8,000, and required endless repairs, borrowed tools, and a bulldog named Bud who wore goggles. America was fascinated, but most people still preferred a good horse. Ah yes, horses, the original Uber. They're still the backbone of transportation in rural areas and small towns. You ride them, pull carts with them, and tie them up outside the general store. They're strong, reliable, and have much better instincts than your average 1900s motor car. But they're also expensive to feed, prone to illness, and, well, messy. Streets are ankle-deep in manure in many towns. It's not just a nuisance, it's a public health issue. You dodge the piles like a strange urban ballet, praying the soles of your boots hold up. If you don't own a horse, you can hire one, along with a buggy, usually operated by someone who drives like they're fleeing a fire. Rural travel is unpredictable at best. Dirt roads turn to mud in a heartbeat. Bridges collapse without warning. You measure distance in time, not miles. It's about half a day to town if the river's not up. You plan around the weather, the light, and how cranky your horse is. For those with nothing but foot power, walking is how most trips are made. School, work, church, the corner store, everything happens within a few miles of your home, and you walk it, rain or shine. Shoes are expensive, so you make yours last. You might even go barefoot in summer, especially if you're a child. Distances feel longer because they are. Everything takes time. Everything takes effort. Every trip is a commitment. And yes, there are boats, especially along rivers and coasts. Steamboats carry goods and passengers up and down major rivers like the Mississippi. Ferries take people across harbours and lakes. Ocean liners, meanwhile, are bringing thousands of immigrants to Ellis Island, packed into steerage where seasickness and communal toilets are just part of the experience. You're not sailing for leisure, you're sailing for survival. Fringe fact, airplanes exist, but barely. In 1903, the Wright brothers make their first powered flight. It lasts 12 seconds and covers 120 feet. That's the entire football field of air travel in 1903. So yes, technically you can fly. But would you want to? Probably not. unless your idea of fun involves a homemade glider and a soft sand dune to crash into. There's also a strange little offshoot: bicycles. The safety bicycle, which looks a lot like today's bike, is popular, especially among young men and progressive women. It's cheap, efficient, and doesn't require oats or gasoline. Bicycles give people freedom and cause moral panic. Churches warn that women on bikes are too independent. Doctors claim excessive pedaling could damage internal organs. Still, people ride. It's the quiet rebellion that no one can quite catch. Here's your scholarly debate. Did the rise of transportation in the early 1900s bring people together or pull them apart? Some argue that faster travel united distant communities and sparked economic growth. Others say it fractured local bonds, made cities overwhelming, and began the long slide into isolation by mobility. You used to know your neighbours because they were all you had. Now you can leave, and many do. But the truth? People adapt. You learn to read a train schedule. You save for a bicycle. You name your horse something reliable, like Nelly or Thunder, or possibly just Horse. You learn to walk fast, dodge trolleys, avoid potholes, and pack light. Travel might be bumpy, but it's possible. And in a country this big, that's all people need: the possibility of motion. Because in early 1900s America, movement isn't just about going somewhere. It's about hope, about change, about getting out of your town, your job, your circumstances. Whether it's by rail, cart, ferry, or foot, getting somewhere else means maybe your life can be different. And that belief? That's what fuels the entire journey. By now, you've probably realized that early 1900s, America isn't just a sepia-toned postcard of simpler times. It's turbulent, loud, and alive with people who are sick of how things are and dead set on making them different. So tonight, we walk into the roaring furnace of the progressive era, where reformers, activists, journalists, and accidental revolutionaries are doing everything in their power to yank America forward, whether it wants to go or not. The progressive era isn't a party, it's more like a controlled demolition. Things don't just get better on their own. People have to fight for it, loudly, constantly, and usually while dodging actual blows. From about 1890 to 1920, this movement grows from a whisper to a full-throated scream. And the issues it tackles? Just a few small ones, like child labour, worker safety, women's suffrage, racial inequality, government corruption, food contamination, and whether your landlord should legally be allowed to trap rats using only wishful thinking. Let's start with the muckrakers, a term that sounds like something you scrape off your boots, and honestly that's about right. These are journalists who dig through the filth of society and slap it onto the public's breakfast table in graphic, unforgettable detail. Upton Sinclair publishes The Jungle in 1906, intending to expose the plight of immigrant workers. Instead, everyone freaks out over the rats, pus, and unidentified other things in their sausage links. The result? The Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, both signed into law that year. Moral of the story: nothing moves Congress like the image of someone's lunch trying to crawl off their plate. Other muckrakers go after oil barons, banking scandals, and crooked politicians. Ida Tarbell dismantles the Standard Oil empire with a series of articles so well researched they read like a surgical takedown. Lincoln Steffens exposes the rot in city governments across the country, making the machine a dirty phrase. These journalists aren't just throwing punches, they're throwing fire, and it sticks. But the progressive era isn't just angry writers and legislative band-aids. It's full of people who are reshaping American society from the ground up. You've got Jane Addams, founder of Hull House in Chicago, pioneering social work and helping immigrants transition into American life. Her settlement house becomes a blueprint for community activism, education, daycare, medical care, job training, basically everything the government should have been doing but wasn't. If you're a woman, this is also the age when you start to break free from the domestic cage, not all at once, but in furious, persistent pecks. The suffragists are marching, picketing, getting arrested, and chaining themselves to fences. They're lobbying, protesting, and organising like their lives depend on it, because in many ways they do. The National American Woman Suffrage Association is gaining power, and by 1920 their relentless push results in the 19th Amendment. But here in the early 1900s, that victory still feels impossibly far off. Let's not forget the labour movement either. The Industrial Revolution gave us railroads, skyscrapers, and horrifying death traps known as workplaces. So, unions step in, led by people like Samuel Gompers, pushing for shorter hours, better wages, and the revolutionary idea that you shouldn't lose a finger every other Tuesday. The American Federation of Labour, AFL, is gaining traction, and strikes become a normal part of life. Steel workers, coal miners, garment workers, everyone's walking out at some point. And then there's the child labour fight. In mills, mines and factories, kids as young as 6 are working 12-hour shifts. Reformers like Lewis Hine start photographing these children, not with pity, but with clarity. Dirty faces, tiny hands, eyes too tired for childhood. These images get published in magazines and newspapers, forcing a stunned public to confront the invisible army propping up their modern lives. Laws begin to change. Slowly. Not enough. But something starts. Here's your historical fact. In 1904, the National Child Labour Committee is formed, and within a few years, it's one of the loudest voices in the reform movement. They don't just criticise, they advocate, lobby and embarrass companies into changing. It doesn't end child labour overnight, but it punches the first hole in the wall. And while the progressives are mostly middle and upper class white reformers, the people they claim to represent don't always feel represented. Working class families often resent outsiders telling them how to live. Immigrant communities push back when Americanization comes with a side of condescension. Black activists like W.E.B. Du Bois are frustrated by the movement's refusal to confront systemic racism. So yes, even as progressives preach equality, they carry plenty of their own blind spots. Here's your open, scholarly debate. Were the progressives heroic reformers saving America from collapse? Or were they privileged meddlers imposing their values on the poor and marginalized? Some historians say the movement's achievements speak for themselves. Safer workplaces, cleaner food, women's suffrage. Others argue the movement was narrow, often racist, and quick to compromise when it benefited their own class. The truth? Probably both. Now let's talk temperance, because this is when the anti-alcohol crusade hits its peak. Women's groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, see alcohol as the root of poverty, violence, and male uselessness. They march, they pray. Some even smash saloons with hatchets, Carrie Nation most famously. Prohibition is still a few years off, but the seeds are planted. It's less about being sober, and more about being heard in a society that constantly tries to silence women. The government, sensing that people are paying attention now, starts making changes, some helpful, some performative. The Sherman Antitrust Act begins breaking up monopolies. City commissions replace corrupt mayors in some areas. Public health departments are founded. The country begins to modernize not just physically but administratively. Bureaucracy grows, for better or worse. But underneath it all is the burning question. Can America actually fix itself? Can this sprawling, unequal, half-industrialized country create a fairer, safer society without falling apart at the seams? For most people, the answer isn't theoretical, it's deeply personal. If you're a coal miner, you care about mine safety because it means you might live to see your kids grow up. If you're a mother, you care about food purity because you've seen what bad milk can do to a baby. If you're an immigrant, you want laws that protect you from bosses who see you as disposable. The stakes are real, and reform isn't some abstract idea, it's survival. Fringe fact: progressive cities began hiring sanitary inspectors, whose job was to walk through neighbourhoods and record everything from how clean your gutters were to whether you had too many flies buzzing around your outhouse. Yes, your outhouse. Progress had a clipboard and a nose for rot. In the end, the progressive era is like a messy house renovation. Plenty of hammers, lots of broken glass, and a constant argument over which wall to tear down next. But for all its flaws, it's a moment when people believe things can get better. Not perfect, not equal, but better. Because in early 1900s America, for the first time in a long time, reform doesn't just feel possible, it feels necessary. The old systems are cracking, the voices are getting louder, and for once, some of them are being heard. By now you've probably figured out that in early 1900s America, childhood isn't a protected bubble of crayons, cartoons and juice boxes. Nope, it's a full-time job, often literally. Tonight we're crawling down into the grimy reality of child labour, where tiny hands feed massive machines, school is optional if it exists at all, and the phrase childhood innocence is basically a sick joke told over the hum of factory belts. Let's not sugarcoat it. Children work, not in a cute lemonade stand way. In a 12-hour shift, 6 days a week, in dangerous conditions with no safety nets way. If you're poor, and most people are, you start working young, maybe 6, maybe 8, old enough to stand, old enough to carry, old enough to follow orders. Childhood, as we know it today, is not a guaranteed phase of life. It's a luxury, like ice cream or indoor plumbing. You might start off selling newspapers, barefoot and yelling headlines on a city corner at sunrise. You get paid by the paper, not by the hour, so if you don't sell, you don't eat. If your voice is loud, your pitch catchy, and your route quick, you'll make just enough to hand over your coins to your mother and fall asleep in your clothes. And if it rains, you get wet. No one's sending backup or buying extras for charity. Maybe you're working in a mill. Cotton, wool, doesn't matter. It's loud, hot, and full of machinery that doesn't care how small your fingers are. You're expected to be nimble, fast, and obedient. Your job? Crawl under moving looms and pick out tangled threads before the machines jam. You don't get a warning. You don't get a break. And if you lose a finger or a hand, well, there's always another kid waiting to take your place. Efficiency is everything. Safety is optional. In the coal mines, it gets worse. Boys as young as 7 work as breaker boys, sitting hunched over chutes of coal, picking out slate and rocks as tons of black dust fill their lungs. No masks, no gloves, no daylight. You work until you can't see straight. If you fall asleep at your post, you're beaten. If you complain, you're fired. And there's always another pair of hands willing to work for pennies. Here's your historical fact. In 1900, roughly 1 in 5 children under the age of 16 in the United States is working. That's about 1.75 million kids. Some work in factories, some in canneries, some on farms from sunup to sundown. This isn't a side hustle. It's the backbone of many industries. Childhood labour isn't just tolerated, it's expected. You're not going to school either, not consistently. Compulsory education laws exist in some states, but they're poorly enforced. If your family needs money, guess what? You're going to work. And schools, when you do attend, aren't always inviting. They're crowded, underfunded, and if you're an immigrant, taught in a language you might not understand yet. Teachers are strict. Corporal punishment is common. And if you're a girl, you're not even expected to finish. Just enough reading to follow a recipe and enough math to count eggs. There's also the social shame loop. Kids who don't work are seen as lazy. Boys who cry or get tired are told to toughen up. Girls who speak out are scolded. And if you think your childhood ends when you turn 18, think again. Most kids are married or managing a household by their mid-teens. You're a kid only as long as people are willing to pretend you are, and society is not in a pretending mood. Fringe fact time. There's a job in textile factories known as a bobbin doffer. It involves replacing full bobbins of thread with empty ones, while the machines are still running. This job is often given to children because their hands are small enough to reach in. Yes, children. Threading their arms into spinning machinery. As you might guess, injuries were common. Lost fingers, broken bones, and the occasional death were chalked up as part of doing business. Now, not everyone agrees this is okay. Reformers, especially women, start raising hell about child labour. People like Florence Kelly, who leads the charge at the National Consumers League, call for laws banning child labour and promoting safe working conditions. She and others argue that kids deserve an education, time to play, time to be kids. They gather statistics, take testimonies, and lobby Congress, state by state. The photos of Lewis Hine become a turning point. He sneaks into mills, factories, and mines with his camera, capturing images of exhausted, injured, malnourished children, barefoot, dusty, hollow-eyed. These photos shock the public. You can't look away. You can't pretend these kids are just helping out. Hine's images make it impossible to keep lying to yourself. Still, change comes slowly. Factory owners push back. They argue that working builds character, that children need discipline, that families would starve without the extra income. In some places, parents themselves oppose reforms, not because they want their kids to suffer, but because they're terrified of not making rent. The debate becomes political, emotional, and personal. Here's your scholarly debate. Did child labour laws rise out of a genuine moral awakening, or from a more self-serving desire to control the labour market and protect adult jobs? Some historians say reformers were driven by compassion and horror. Others argue that banning child labour also helped suppress wages and reduce competition in certain trades. Either way, the result was real. Children slowly began to leave factories and return to school, but only after years of struggle. And class matters here too. A lot. Wealthy families don't send their kids to work. They send them to school, hire tutors, enroll them in music lessons. Their kids get pianos, your kid gets a pickaxe. The class divide in childhood experience is brutal and unrelenting. A rich child might never set foot in a factory. A poor child might never set foot in a school. And in that gap, entire futures are shaped or destroyed. Race makes things worse. Black children in the South often work in fields from dawn until dusk, especially during harvest seasons. There's little hope of upward mobility. Segregated schools are underfunded and overcrowded. Native American children are forced into boarding schools designed to strip away their culture. They're forbidden to speak their language, cut off from their families, and taught that their heritage is something to be erased. It's not just labour, it's assimilation by force. And girls? Oh, the double burden. They work outside the home, laundries, canneries, shops, and then come home to cook, clean, and help raise siblings. They're expected to be obedient, mature, and quiet. And if something terrible happens, harassment, abuse, there's no one to protect them. In many families, their silence is survival. Yet somehow, kids endure. They play when they can, stickball in alleys, tag in the fields, jumping rope with frayed twine. They tell jokes. They make up songs. They carve slivers of joy out of exhaustion. Because even in the hardest lives, children find ways to be children, until the world takes it away again. In time, the laws will change. The factories will be forced to adapt. The schools will slowly improve. But in the early 1900s, if you're a child in America, you work, you sacrifice, and you grow up fast, because no one's going to do it for you. And now, at long last, you get a break. Not a long one, not a spa day, but a few fleeting hours to catch your breath, forget your coal-streaked shirt, and enjoy the weird, wondrous world of early 1900s entertainment. Because even if your job stinks, your lungs hurt, and your tenement ceiling leaks when it thinks about rain, you're still human. You still need to laugh, sing, shout, and cheer for something. And oh boy, does this era deliver, just not in the way you'd expect. Let's start with the king of popular entertainment, vaudeville. If you're not familiar, vaudeville is basically a live variety show on caffeine. It's chaos in a bowler hat. Comedy, music, dance, animal tricks, acrobatics, ventriloquists, strongmen, magic acts, and maybe a guy who juggles flaming knives while yelling in German. It's family-friendly mostly, but with just enough edge to keep things interesting. Shows run all day, from matinees to evening performances, and theatres cycle through acts like popcorn through a brass machine. You buy your ticket for a few cents, maybe a dime, and enter a smoky, crammed theatre filled with laughter, peanut shells, and a pianist trying desperately to keep up with whatever's happening on stage. No microphones, no CGI, just raw talent, awkward timing, and the occasional trained seal. Vaudeville is the Netflix of its time, except it smells like sweat and popcorn grease, and you can't hit pause when you need to pee. For a moment you forget your problems, you laugh at a rubber-faced comic doing pratfalls, you hum along with the latest hit tune, probably something catchy and weird like In the Good Old Summertime. You cheer when the juggler nails his finale. This isn't just entertainment, it's escape. Affordable, accessible, and alive. But if you're looking for something a little more modern, brace yourself. Motion pictures are here. They're short, silent, and projected onto a screen with the grace of a candlelit séance. These early films are usually shown in Nickelodeons, tiny storefront theatres where you pay 5 cents to sit in a hard chair and stare at a screen while a pianist pounds out a dramatic tune 2 feet from your head. The movies are barely 15 minutes long. No sound, no colour, and no dialogue, just title cards and overacted facial expressions. The plots are simple. A train arrives, a man kisses his wife, a burglar climbs through a window, a cow explodes. Okay, maybe not the last one, but close. People love it. They're mesmerised. Some scream when the train rushes toward the screen. Others duck when a character throws something toward the camera. It's new, it's thrilling. And it's only the beginning. Your historical fact. In 1903, the Great Train Robbery debuts, an 11-minute masterpiece with quick cuts, cross-cutting scenes, and a final shot of a gunman firing directly at the audience. It shocks viewers and transforms film from novelty to storytelling medium. Hollywood doesn't exist yet, but the seed has been planted and it's growing fast. And then there's music, which in 1900 isn't something you stream, it's something you hear. Maybe your neighbour plays piano, Maybe your dad fiddles on the porch. Maybe a street band drifts past your window, wheezing out ragtime rhythms on a dusty afternoon. Live music is everywhere, and it's incredibly diverse. Classical quartets, brass bands, Appalachian ballads, gospel choirs, Yiddish theatre songs, and ragtime, especially ragtime with its bouncy, syncopated beat making the whole country tap its foot. Player pianos are wildly popular in middle-class homes. Slot in a paper roll, wind the crank, and let the magic happen. Suddenly your parlour becomes a private concert hall, and everyone gathers around to sing. It's communal, it's loud, and it's very much not optional. Because someone's always shouting, "Sing louder, Ma!" If you're feeling a little wild, you might spend a few cents at a penny arcade. Think early amusement park meets proto-casino meets extremely questionable hygiene. You've got stereoscopes, early 3D viewers, strength testers, fortune-telling machines, and mechanical moving pictures. You stick your face into a viewer and crank a handle to watch a woman dance or a boxing match unfold, frame by frame. It's clunky and slightly creepy, but in 1900 it feels like the bleeding edge of technology. For those lucky enough to live near a fairground or seaside boardwalk, amusement parks are starting to make their entrance, especially Coney Island, which is a fever dream of fried food, carnival barkers, bizarre attractions, and thrilling new inventions like the roller coaster. That's right. By 1904, you can pay a few cents to be strapped into a rickety wooden cart and thrown around on gravity's worst idea. Screams, laughter, and hats flying into the breeze, all included. Fringe fact, in 1904, Luna Park opens at Coney Island, featuring 250,000 electric lights, human freak shows, a ride called A Trip to the Moon, and trained elephants giving children rides. It's Disneyland's weird, chaotic grandpa, and people can't get enough of it. Now, if you're in the mood for something a bit more wholesome, or at least quieter, parlour games are your jam. Charades, dominoes, snap, or just sitting around the table reading aloud from a book of poetry or ghost stories. Yes, people read to each other for fun. They also knit, whittle, embroider, or sew patchwork quilts while swapping gossip. Entertainment doesn't always involve fireworks. Sometimes it's just your family, a bowl of apples, and an extremely competitive game of checkers that ends in mild emotional trauma. And don't forget sports. Baseball is already America's pastime. You listen to games on street corners, follow box scores in the paper, and, if you're lucky, catch a game in person. Players like Cy Young and Honus Wagner are already legends. The stadiums are small, wooden and rowdy. Hot dogs are new. So is heckling. It's loud, dusty, and completely addictive. Boxing is also booming, though not exactly legal in every state. Fights are sometimes held in secret in barns or basements, with paid cops looking the other way. Betting is rampant. So is blood. But crowds love it. The drama, the violence, the chance to see someone's teeth fly into the front row. It's gladiator stuff for the industrial age. But not everyone is entertained the same way. Entertainment is segregated both by race and class. Black audiences often have to sit in separate sections, or aren't allowed in at all. Vaudeville circuits are divided into white and coloured routes. Black performers have fewer opportunities, worse pay, and stricter rules. And yet, from this restriction comes innovation, particularly in black vaudeville and ragtime, which helped birth jazz, blues, and eventually rock and roll. The most enduring sounds of American culture are being born in venues that most of white America doesn't even notice yet. Here's your scholarly debate. Was early mass entertainment a great democratizer, bringing people together across class and ethnicity, or did it reinforce the same divisions it pretended to transcend? Some argue that a 5-cent movie ticket gave everyone access to art. Others point out that racism, sexism, and exploitation ran deep beneath the velvet curtains and piano chords. The truth? Entertainment gave people escape, but not always justice. Still, for those few hours when the curtain rises or the projector hums to life, or the street musician hits that perfect note, you forget. You forget the factory. You forget the rent. You forget that your shoes are falling apart and your back hurts and the cough in your chest isn't going away. You laugh. You cheer. You lean in closer. Because in early 1900s America, entertainment isn't just a distraction. It's resistance. It's hope. It's a way of saying, we're still here and we still know how to live. So here we are, standing at the edge of the 1910s, peering back over the wild, unpredictable, unfiltered ride that was early 1900s America. Before we dim the lights and pull the covers up, let's zoom out and ask the big lingering question. What did it all mean? What was daily life really like, and what did it leave behind? Because even if you've made it through the filth, the fire, the food poisoning, and the factory floors with your soul somewhat intact, you're still left wondering what kind of country you've just lived through. Was it a land of promise, or a cautionary tale, a disaster in progress, or the blueprint for something better? Let's start with what you can't ignore, the sheer amount of hardship. Life in the early 1900s is not easy, not soft and not fair. You work too much, sleep too little, and live on the edge of collapse, whether that's financial, physical, or emotional. You bury children and parents far too soon. You fear illness because there's no cure. You watch your neighbours burn alive in tenement fires, drown in floods, or vanish in strikes that never make it past the front page. You grow up fast. You age early. You die younger than you should. But here's the thing. You don't give up. You adapt. You innovate. You endure. In your work, you carve out pride from thankless jobs. Whether you're scrubbing floors or repairing rail ties or cooking for 20 in a boarding house kitchen, you find moments of dignity in the grind. You build skills no one gives you credit for. You save pennies, skip meals, sew your own clothes, fix what breaks. And still, somehow, you keep others afloat. Your children, your siblings, your aging parents. You do it because there's no safety net. You are the net. And in your community, however run down or overlooked, you find ways to survive together. Neighbours share soup, stories, firewood, and hand-me-down boots. Churches offer food, shelter, and something close to hope. Immigrant neighbourhoods keep old languages alive. Black communities build schools, press newspapers, start businesses, despite the weight of systemic racism pressing down on every corner. Resistance isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just opening your door to someone with nowhere else to go. You also begin to push back, politically, socially, loudly, through labour unions, through suffrage marches, through education reform, tenant organising, strike lines, and sanitation crusades. You organise boycotts, you sign petitions, you risk jail, reputation and livelihood to change the rules. And slowly, through all the yelling and setbacks and bloody knuckles, you do. Because for all its dysfunction, America in the early 1900s is alive with momentum. It doesn't know where it's going, but it's going. Cities are growing faster than maps can keep up with. Immigrants are flooding in, reshaping culture block by block. Technology is reshaping time itself. Suddenly, you can cross the country in days, light a room with a switch, talk across oceans through cables. It's messy, chaotic, dangerous, but exhilarating. Your historical fact. Between 1900 and 1910, the US population grows by more than 21 million people, fueled by immigration and urbanization. That's the largest growth in any decade to date. America's streets aren't just crowded, they're bursting. At the same time, old systems are cracking. People are questioning religion, capitalism, government, gender roles, and even the very definition of success. Women want more than the parlour. Workers want more than a paycheck. Immigrants want to be seen as American, not just tolerated. Everyone's asking, what do we owe each other? What kind of country is this going to be? And that brings us to one of the biggest debates still echoing from this time. Was early 1900s America a place of freedom, or a machine of exploitation? Some say it was the greatest era of opportunity in history, when anyone could rise if they had grit. Others say it was a time of massive inequality, where a few lived like kings while millions scraped by in dirt and debt. The truth? It's both. It always is. The bootstraps myth was already in full swing, but no one talks about how the boots came with holes and no soles for most. Fringe fact, there were actual manuals published for immigrants titled things like How to Behave in America. These handbooks gave instructions on how to dress, how to speak, when to bathe, and why it was important to smile, but not too much. They weren't just guides. They were subtle reminders. You can be here, but only if you don't make us uncomfortable. So much of early American life is about proving you belong, proving you're worthy of space, of fairness, of freedom. And that exhausting process leaves its mark on families, on neighbourhoods, on institutions. But it also plants seeds of activism, of change, of memory. You see it in the children who do make it to school and grow up to become teachers and lawyers and reformers. You see it in the veterans of labour strikes who go on to reshape workplace laws. You see it in the women who marched in long skirts and got arrested, only to win the vote 2 decades later. You see it in the stubborn resilience of people who never had a fair shot but took one anyway. And what's wild is that this version of America, this clunky, gaslit, soot-covered machine, is still foundational. You can trace so much of modern life back to it. Our laws, our cities, our labour systems, our healthcare gaps, our education battles, our obsession with progress, the fight for equity, the glorification of work, the dream of upward mobility that doesn't always hold up to scrutiny. It's all here. The ghosts of the 1900s still haunt every corner of American life. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe remembering where we started makes it easier to see how far we still need to go. Not in a hand-wringing, nostalgic kind of way, but in a way that honours the people who lived it, who carried water, bore injustice, stitched shirts until their fingers bled, and still found time to sing. Not perfect, not heroes, just people, doing their best every single day. Because that's what early 1900s America really was. Not a myth, not a fairy tale, not a total disaster. Just millions of people trying to make sense of a world changing faster than anyone could keep up with, and daring to believe they had a place in it. So tonight, as you sink into your mattress and let this century-old world drift off into the shadows, remember, you've lived it. You've walked the streets, eaten the stew, smelled the soot, danced at the vaudeville, dodged the fire, read the headlines, worked the shift, and cheered for the reformers. You didn't just watch history, you wore it. And now, after 30 long nights, or maybe just a particularly cozy binge session, you've made it. You've survived the early 1900s in all their soot-smudged, steam-powered, sausage-questionable glory. You've trudged through crowded tenements and factory floors, clanged along trolley tracks and railway lines, peered into penny arcades, and marched beside suffragists and strikers alike. You've seen the dream, the grit, the grind, and still, somehow, the hope. So let's take a breath. A real one. Let your muscles relax a little. You've done the work. You've carried the coal bucket, mopped the floors, spooned lard into a dented frying pan, and hung your laundry with wooden pegs in a tenement alley. You've picked slate from coal chutes, chased trolleys, dodged horse dung, argued politics by gaslight, and tried not to lose a limb in the spinning looms. It's been a lot. But what you've really done is taken a walk through the bones of a country learning to live with itself. A country struggling to define its values, not just in law books, but in meat markets, union halls, schoolhouses, and parlours. You've met the real people of the early 20th century. Not the ones in top hats and stiff portraits, but the ones in patched boots, frayed aprons and muddy streets. The ones whose stories don't always get told, but whose lives held up the entire machine. You've seen that America wasn't all bad or all good. It was just human, loud, unfair, beautiful, infuriating, inspiring, messy in the way that only real life can be. And now that you've lived a piece of it, maybe it makes a little more sense why we are the way we are now. Or maybe it doesn't, but at least now you've got the context to know what we're still carrying and what we ought to leave behind. So here's to the millions who never made the headlines, the kids who never had childhoods, the women who never got credit, the workers who never got justice, and the dreamers who never got to see the world they were fighting to build, but fought anyway. And here's to you, time traveller, for taking the journey. Now dim the lights, let the factory fade, let the trolley bell grow distant, let the soot settle, and let your mind drift quietly back from 1900 to wherever you are right now, whether that's the quiet hum of your bedroom fan or the last flicker of a screen in the dark. History isn't just about remembering, it's about feeling it, breathing it in, and carrying a little piece of it forward. So, thanks for walking with me. Sweet dreams.